Part 1. Motivation. If this life not be a real fight, in which something is eternally gained for the universe by success, it is no better than a game of private theatrics from which one may withdraw at will. But it feels like a real fight, as if there were something really wild in the universe which we are needed to redeem. William James. 1. Motivation decoded. The central premise of this book is that impossible has a formula. Whenever we see the impossible become possible, we are witnessing the end result of a quartet of skills: motivation, learning, creativity, and flow, expertly applied and significantly amplified. The goal of this book is to use science to decipher these skills. We want to get at the basic biological mechanisms that make each of them run, then use what we learn to make them run better, which is really what I mean by getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. In practice, we are going to work our way through 4 main sections, exploring motivation, learning, creativity, and flow in turn. In each section, I'm going to break down what science can tell us about how these skills work in the brain and body. Then, through a series of exercises, teach you the best ways to apply this information in your own life. The place to begin is with motivation, which is what starts us down the path of peak performance. Yet motivation, as psychologists use the term, is actually a catch-all for 3 subsets of skills: drive, grit, and goals. Drive, the subject of the next 2 chapters, refers to powerful emotional motivators such as curiosity, passion, and purpose. These are feelings that drive behavior automatically. This is the big deal. When most people think about motivation, they're actually thinking about persistence, meaning the stuff we need to keep going once our drive has left us. Consider the simplest drive: curiosity. When we're curious about a subject, doing the hard work to learn more about that subject doesn't feel like hard work. It requires effort for certain, but it feels like play. And when work becomes play, that's one way to know for sure. Now you're playing the infinite game. Goals, the topic of Chapter 4, are about figuring out exactly where we're actually trying to go. For a host of neurobiological reasons that will be explored later, when we know where we're trying to go, we get there much more quickly. Since the road to impossible is long by definition, we'll need this boost in acceleration to achieve our mission. Grit, the subject of Chapter 5, is what most people think of when they think of motivation. It's persistence, determination, and fortitude. The ability to continue with the journey no matter the difficulty involved. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, our quest starts with drive. And the reason is simple. There's really no other option. The psychology of drive. Stalking the impossible demands digging deep on a daily basis. Lao Tzu wasn't wrong. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with 1 step, but it's still a journey of 1,000 miles, uphill, in the dark, both ways. Since impossible is always an arduous trek, elite-level performers never rely on a single source of fuel to sustain them along the way. And this is true for both physical fuel and psychological fuel. On the physical side, even though this is not the point of this book, elite performers always try to get enough sleep and exercise and maintain proper hydration and nutrition. They stack, that is, cultivate, amplify, and align the foundational requirements for producing physical energy. Equally crucial, elite performers stack psychological fuel sources. They cultivate and align drivers such as curiosity, passion, and purpose. By stacking these sources of mental energy, they ensure on-demand access to all of life's most potent emotional fuels. So, what drives us? One way to think about this question is from an evolutionary perspective. We know that scarcity drives evolution. Any problem regularly encountered on a quest to gather resources is a problem that evolution already spent millions of years driving us to solve. Think of evolution as a video game with two main levels. To win on level 1, a player must obtain more resources, food, water, shelter, mates, and so on, than the other players in the game. On level 2, the player must turn those resources into children and help those children survive, either by having so many that there's no way predators can eat them all, which is what fish do, or by keeping those children safe and teaching them how to obtain resources for themselves, which is the human method. At each level, resource acquisition is key. As discussed, only two strategies are available. Either you fight over dwindling resources, or you get creative and make more resources. Thus, when we talk about drive from an evolutionary perspective, what we're really talking about are the psychological fuels that energize behaviors that best solve resource scarcity: fight, flee, and explore, innovate. Fear is a psychological driver, because it drives us to fight over resources, to flee and avoid becoming someone else's resources, or to pack up the family and sail across an ocean in a quest to, you guessed it, find more resources. Curiosity is another driver, because it makes us wonder if there might be more resources across that ocean. Passion drives us to master the skills required to successfully sail that ocean. Goals drive us because they tell us what resources we're trying to find on the other side of that ocean and the reason we're trying to find them. And this list goes on. To make things more manageable, scientists split our psychological drivers into two categories: extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic drivers are rewards that are external to ourselves. These are things like money, fame, or sex, and they're definitely potent. Money translates into food, clothing, and shelter, so the brain treats our desire for it as a basic survival need. Fame might seem trivial, but famous people often have significantly more access to resources: food, water, shelter, mates, and so on, so we're wired to want it. And sex is the only way for humans to win evolution's game of survival, which is why sex sells and the bars are always packed on Friday night. Intrinsic drivers are the opposite. These are psychological and emotional forces such as curiosity, passion, meaning, and purpose. The pleasure of mastery, which we feel as the sensation of a job well done, is another potent example. Autonomy, the desire to be in charge of one's own life, is yet another. For most of the last century, researchers believed that extrinsic drivers were the more powerful of the pair. But this shifted over the past few decades, as intrinsic drivers have become better understood. What we now know is that there's a motivational hierarchy at work. External drivers are fantastic, but only until we feel safe and secure, meaning that we have enough money to pay for food, clothing, and shelter, and have a little left over for fun. In US dollars and today's economy, the research shows that this is somewhere around $75,000 a year. Measure happiness levels among Americans, as Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman discovered, and they rise in direct proportion to income, but only until we earn about $75,000 a year, After that point, they start to diverge wildly. Happiness becomes untethered to income because, once we can meet our basic needs, the lure of all the stuff it took to meet them begins to lose its luster. Once extrinsic drivers start to fade, intrinsic drivers take over. In business, we see this played out in how companies try to motivate employees. Once people feel fairly compensated for their time, meaning once that number starts to creep over $75,000 a year, big raises and annual bonuses won't actually improve their productivity or performance. After that basic needs line is crossed, employees want intrinsic rewards. They want to be in control of their own time, autonomy. They want to work on projects that interest them, curiosity/passion, and they want to work on projects that matter, meaning and purpose. This, too, is evolution at work. It's not that evolution ever lets us stop playing the get more resources game. It's that our strategy evolves. Once baseline needs are met, you can devote yourself to ways to get, well, you guessed it, seriously more resources for yourself, for your family, for your tribe, for your species. As high-minded as something like meaning and purpose might seem as a driver, this is actually evolution's way of saying, okay, you've got enough resources for yourself and your family. Now it's time to help your tribe or your species get more. This is also why, in the brain, there's really not much difference between drivers. Intrinsic drivers, extrinsic drivers, it doesn't matter. In the end, like so much of life, it all comes down to neurochemistry. The neurochemistry of reward. Motivation is message. It's the brain saying, hey, get off the couch, do this thing, it's super important to your survival. In order to send this message, the brain relies on 4 basic components: neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the messages themselves, and neuroanatomy and networks, which are the places those messages are sent from and received. The messages themselves are basic. In the brain, electrical signals have only one meaning: do more of what you're doing. If enough electricity pours into a neuron, that neuron fires, sending that electricity onward to the next neuron. If enough electricity pours into that next neuron, it fires too. It's like water in a bucket on a water wheel. Pour enough water into a bucket, and sooner or later it spills into the next bucket, and the next. It's that mechanical. Chemical signals are similarly simple, though they can have one of 2 meanings: do more of what you're doing, or do less of what you've been doing. Yet neurochemicals aren't intelligent. When we say neurochemicals carry messages, do more of this or do less of that, they themselves are the messages. On the inside of synapses, which is the little gap between neurons where neurochemicals do their jobs, there are receptors. Each receptor has a particular geometric shape. Each neurochemical has a particular geometric shape. Either these shapes line up, so the round neurochemical blob fits inside the round neurochemical blob hole, or they don't. If the round key of the neurochemical dopamine fits inside the round lock of a dopamine receptor, then the message gets sent. Neuroanatomy and networks, meanwhile, are the places those messages are sent from and received. The where in the brain something is taking place. Neuroanatomy describes specific brain structures, the insula or the medial prefrontal cortex. But in the brain, structures are designed to perform specific functions. The medial prefrontal cortex, for example, aids in decision-making and the retrieval of long-term memories. So if a particular do more message arrives in the medial prefrontal cortex, the result is more, or sometimes more finely tuned, decision-making, and long-term memory retrieval. Networks, meanwhile, refer to brain structures that are hardwired together by direct connections, or structures that tend to activate at the same time. For example, the insula and the medial prefrontal cortex are wired together and frequently do work at the same time, making them important hubs in the so-called default mode network. When the brain wants to motivate us, it sends out a neurochemical message via one of 7 specific networks. These networks are ancient devices found in all mammals that correspond to the behavior they're designed to produce. There is a system for fear, another for anger/rage, and a third for grief, or what's technically known as separation distress. The lust system drives us to procreate. The care/nurture system urges us to protect and educate our young. Yet when we talk about drive, the psychological energy that pushes us forward, we're really talking about the 2 final systems: play/social engagement and seeking/desire. The play/social engagement system is about all the fun stuff we used to do as kids: running, jumping, chasing, wrestling, and, of course, socializing. Scientists once assumed the point of play was practice. We practice fight today because tomorrow could bring an actual fight for survival. Now we know that play is mostly designed to teach us about social rules and social interaction. When you're playing with your little brother and Mom screams, "Don't pick on someone smaller than you," she's exactly on message. The point of play is to teach us lessons like might doesn't make right. It's nature's way of instructing us in morality. And that instruction occurs automatically. When we play, the brain releases dopamine and oxytocin, 2 of our most crucial reward chemicals. These are pleasure drugs that make us feel good when we accomplish, or try to accomplish, anything that fulfills a basic survival need. Dopamine is the brain's primary reward chemical, with oxytocin a close second. Yet serotonin, endorphins, norepinephrine, and anandamide also play a role. The pleasurable feeling created by each of these chemicals drives us to act, and, if that action was successful, reinforces the behavior in memory. Moreover, neurochemicals are specialized. Dopamine specializes in driving all the various manifestations of desire, from our sexual appetites to our quest for knowledge. We feel its presence as excitement, enthusiasm, and the desire to make meaning from a situation. When your phone dings and you're curious to check it out, that's dopamine at work. The urge to decipher black hole theory, the hunger to climb Mount Everest, the desire to test your limits, that's dopamine too. Norepinephrine is similar but different. It's the brain's version of adrenaline, sometimes called noradrenaline. This neurochemical produces a huge increase in energy and alertness, stimulating both hyperactivity and hypervigilance. When you're obsessed with an idea, can't stop working on a project, or can't stop thinking about the person you just met, norepinephrine is responsible. Oxytocin produces trust, love, and friendship. It's the pro-social neurochemical that underpins everything from loving, long-term marital bliss to cooperative, well-functioning companies. We feel its presence as joy and love. It promotes trust, underpins fidelity and empathy, and heightens cooperation and communication. Serotonin is a calming, peaceful chemical that provides a gentle lift in mood. It's that satiated feeling that comes after a good meal or a great orgasm, and it's partially responsible for that post-meal/post-coital urge to take a nap. But it also appears to play a role in satisfaction and contentment, that feeling of a job well done. Endorphins and anandamide Our final two pleasure chemicals are pain-killing bliss producers. They're both heavy-duty stress relievers, replacing the weight of the everyday with a euphoric sense of relaxed happiness. It's that all is right in the world sensation that shows up during experiences like runner's high or when we catch our second wind. Yet the neurochemistry of reward isn't simply about how individual neurochemicals work, as we're often motivated by combinations of neurochemicals. Dopamine plus oxytocin is the blend beneath the delight of play. Passion, including everything from the passion of an artist for their craft to the passion of romantic love, is underpinned by the pairing of norepinephrine and dopamine. Flow may be the biggest neurochemical cocktail of all. The state appears to blend all 6 of the brain's major pleasure chemicals and may be one of the only times you get all 6 at once. This potent mix explains why people describe flow as their favorite experience, while psychologists refer to it as the source code of intrinsic motivation. The seeking/desire system is the second system that plays an important role in drive. Sometimes called the reward system, this is a general-purpose network that helps animals acquire the resources they need for survival. In pure form, the seeking system provokes intense and enthusiastic exploration and anticipatory excitement and learning, writes Jaak Panksepp, the neuroscientist who discovered these 7 systems. When fully aroused, the seeking system fills the mind with interest and motivates organisms to effortlessly search for the things they need. Emphasis mine. I emphasized effortlessly for a reason. If we can tune the system correctly, the results show up automatically. Consider passion. When we're passionate, we don't have to work hard to stay on task. Because of dopamine and norepinephrine, that happens automatically. Every day, I wake up at 4 a.m. and start writing. Does this demand grit? Occasionally. But mostly, grit takes care of itself, because I have curiosity, passion, and purpose. When I wake up, I'm excited to see where the words will take me. Even on those crappy nights when I wake up in a panic, I retaliate by writing. Writing is where I run when I need to run. My craft is my salvation. And if you talk to anyone who has tackled the impossible, you'll hear a similar tale. Consider the late great skier and skydiver Shane McConkey. As much as any athlete in history, McConkey extended the limits of human possibility, not just accomplishing the impossible, but doing so again and again. And if you asked McConkey how he pulled this off, his answer frequently stressed the importance of intrinsic drive. I'm doing what I love. If you're doing what you want to do all the time, then you're happy. You're not going to work every day wishing you were doing something else. I get up and I go to work every day and I'm stoked. That does not suck. Yet the same neurochemical drive that helped Shane McConkey accomplish the impossible is available to all of us. It's our basic biology at work, the push of our most critical emotional fuels, expertly cocktailed for maximum thrust. The recipe for drive. Over the next 2 chapters, we're going to learn to stack, that is, cultivate, align, amplify, and deploy our 5 most potent intrinsic drivers: curiosity, passion, purpose, Chapter 2, autonomy and mastery, Chapter 3. We're focusing on this stack of 5, both because they're our most powerful drivers and because they're neurobiologically designed to work together. Curiosity is where we'll begin, because that's where the biology is designed to begin. This is your basic interest in something, neurochemically underpinned by a little bit of norepinephrine and dopamine. And while curiosity alone is a potent driver, it's also a foundational ingredient in passion, which is an even bigger driver. Thus, will next learn to turn that flicker of curiosity into the flame of passion by adding a lot more neurochemical fuel, norepinephrine and dopamine, to our intrinsic fire. Next comes meaning and purpose, which require connecting our individual passion to a cause much greater than ourselves. Once this happens, we see oxytocin added to the equation and an even bigger increase in core performance traits such as focus, productivity, and resilience. And our intrinsic fire burns that much hotter. Finally, once you have a purpose, you need to layer on the two remaining intrinsic drivers, autonomy and mastery. More specifically, once you have a purpose, the system demands autonomy, which is the freedom to pursue that purpose. Then the system requires mastery, which is the desire to continually improve the skills needed to pursue that purpose. As you can see, it's a tightly aligned stack. But built correctly, life will feel exciting, interesting, full of possibility, and thick with meaning. This uptick in energy is one of the reasons why stalking the impossible might be easier than you originally suspected. With intrinsic drivers properly stacked, our biology is working for us rather than against us. In short, the act of stalking the impossible actually helps us to stalk the impossible. 2. The Passion Recipe. Over the course of this chapter, we're going to start stacking intrinsic drivers, learning to cultivate curiosity, amplify it into passion, and transform the results into purpose. This is not an overnight process. Some steps may take weeks to accomplish, a few could last for months. Yet, take the time to get it right. You don't want to be 2 years into pursuing your passion only to discover it was actually a phase. You want to take the time to dial in intrinsic drivers today, because 2 years from now, if you discover you've dialed wrong, consider how frustrated you'll feel having to start all over again. In peak performance, sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. This is one of those times. Make a list. The easiest way to start stacking intrinsic drivers is with a list. If you have the option, write this list in a notebook rather than on a computer. There's a powerful relationship between hand motion and memory, which means, for learning, pen and paper triumph over laptop and keyboard every time. Start by writing down 25 things you're curious about. And by curious, all I mean is that if you had a spare weekend, you'd be interested in reading a couple of books on the topic, attending a few lectures, and maybe having a conversation or two with an expert. When it comes to creating this list, be as specific as possible. Don't just be interested in football or punk rock or food. These categories are too vague to be useful. Instead, be curious about the pass-blocking mechanics required to play left tackle, the evolution of political punk from crass to rise against, or the potential for grasshoppers to become a primary human food source in the next 10 years. The specificity gives your brain's pattern recognition system the raw materials it needs to make connections between ideas. The more detailed the information, the better. Hunt for intersections. After your list is complete, look for the places where these 25 ideas intersect. Take the example I just used. Say both grasshoppers as a food source and the mechanics of playing left tackle are on your list. Well, if you're into pass-blocking mechanics, you're probably also interested in the nutritional requirements necessary to play left tackle. Insects are exceptionally high in protein. Would they make a good football food? The point is that curiosity, by itself, is not enough to create true passion. There's just not enough neurochemistry being produced for the motivation you require. Instead, you want to look for places where 3 or 4 items on your curiosity list intersect. If you can spot the overlap between multiple items, well, now you're cooking. There's real energy there. When multiple curiosity streams intersect, you not only amp up engagement, you create the necessary conditions for pattern recognition, or the linking of new ideas together. Pattern recognition is what the brain does at a very basic level. It's essentially the fundamental job of most neurons. As a result, whenever we recognize a pattern, the brain rewards us with a tiny squirt of dopamine. Dopamine, like all neurochemicals, plays a lot of different roles in the brain. We talked about a couple of those a few sections back. Here we want to expand on this idea, focusing on 4 additional jobs that dopamine does in the brain. First, dopamine is a powerful focusing drug. When it's in our system, attention is laser-targeted on the task at hand. We're excited, engaged, and more likely to drop into flow. Second, dopamine tunes signal-to-noise ratios in the brain, which means the neurochemical increases signal, decreases noise, and as a result, helps us detect more patterns. There's a feedback loop here. We get dopamine when we first detect a link between 2 ideas, a pattern, and the dopamine that we get helps us detect even more links, pattern recognition. If you've ever done a crossword puzzle or played Sudoku, the little rush of pleasure you get when you fill in a correct answer, that's dopamine. The reason we tend to fill in multiple answers in a row? That's dopamine tweaking the signal-to-noise ratio and helping us detect even more patterns. This is why creative ideas tend to spiral, and why one good idea often leads to the next, and the next, and the next. Third, dopamine is one of those aforementioned reward chemicals, a feel-good drug produced by the brain to drive behavior. Dopamine feels really good. Cocaine is widely considered the most addictive drug on Earth, yet all that cocaine does is cause the brain to release large quantities of dopamine, then block its reuptake. And the pleasure produced by this chemical is key to passion. The more dopamine you get, the more fun and addictive the experience. The more fun and addictive the experience, the more you can't wait to do it again. Finally, dopamine, like all neurochemicals, amplifies memory. This, too, is automatic. A quick shorthand for how learning works in the brain. The more neurochemicals that show up during an experience, the more likely that experience will move from short-term holding into long-term storage. Memory enhancement is another key role played by neurochemicals. They tag experiences as important, save for later. By stacking motivations, that is, layering curiosity atop curiosity atop curiosity, we're increasing drive, but not effort. This is what happens when our own internal biology does the heavy lifting for us. You'll work harder, but you won't notice the work. Also, because dopamine provides a host of additional cognitive benefits, amplified focus, better learning, faster pattern recognition, you'll also work smarter. These are 2 more reasons why stalking the impossible might be a little easier than you suspected. Play in the intersections. Now that you've identified the spots where curiosities overlap, play in those intersections for a little while. Devote 20 to 30 minutes a day to listening to podcasts, watching videos, reading articles, books, whatever, on any aspect of that overlap. If you're interested in supply chain management in the healthcare industry, and you're also curious about artificial intelligence, then it's time to explore the advantages and disadvantages that artificial intelligence brings to supply chain management in the healthcare industry. Or to return to our earlier example, if insects as a protein source and the mechanics of playing left tackle are your starting points, then it's time to play around at their intersection. What are the nutritional requirements for high performance in contact sports? Can insects satisfy those requirements? The goal is to feed those curiosities a little bit at a time and feed them on a daily basis. This slow growth strategy takes advantage of the brain's inherent learning software. When you advance your knowledge a little bit at a time, you're giving your adaptive unconscious a chance to process that information. In the study of creativity, this process is known as incubation. What's actually happening is pattern recognition. Automatically, the brain begins looking for connections between older bits of info you've already learned and the newer bits you're currently learning. Over time, this means more patterns, more dopamine, more motivation, and eventually a bit of expertise. And it's expertise that arrives with less work. When we play with information we're curious about, we're not forcing the brain to make new discoveries. There's no pressure, which is helpful since too much stress lessens our ability to learn. Instead, we're seeing what connections our brains naturally make via the incubation phase, then allowing our biology to do the hard work for us. We're letting our pattern recognition system find connections between curiosities that make us even more curious, which is how you cultivate passion. Yet to increase your chances of making those connections, pay attention to two sets of details, both the history of the subject and the technical language used to describe that subject. History is a narrative. Every subject is a voyage of curiosity. Someone had a question, someone answered that question, and this led to another question, and another, and another. Lucky for us, our brains love narrative, which is nothing more than pattern recognition over time. If you pay attention to historical details as you play around in a new subject, your brain will naturally stitch these details together into a coherent story via our biological need to link cause with effect. It's automatic. You'll also get a little dopamine along the way as you recognize those historical patterns, and this will increase curiosity and amplify motivation even further. Once the brain constructs that narrative, it functions like a giant Christmas tree. All the little details you learn along the way are the ornaments. But having this big tree, this overarching structure, makes those ornaments easier to hang. You don't have to work as hard to remember them. This historical narrative becomes a de facto memory palace, allowing you to take a brand new piece of information and correctly slot it into its exact right place. If we construct that narrative, we'll see learning rates increase and time to mastery decrease. The technical language that surrounds a subject is the second place to put your attention. Why? Jargon, while annoying, is annoyingly precise. Often, large chunks of the explanation of a subject are contained within the technical language that surrounds that subject. The obvious example is human versus Homo sapiens. Both terms point in the same direction, but the Latin version not only contains the thing, a human, but also its evolutionary history, genus and species, plus a little color commentary. Apparently, someone once thought we were wise apes. Thus, understanding a subject's insider parlance allows you to see the ideas and the connective tissue that holds these ideas together. Homo sapiens not only names the thing, but tells you that the thing descended from apes and is smarter than apes, or at least thinks it's smarter than apes. Most important to our quest is where this process leads. Knowing the history of a subject and the technical language that surrounds that subject helps you converse with others about these ideas. Those conversations are critical for the next step. Go public. Cultivating real passion isn't an overnight process. It's not enough to play around in the spots where multiple curiosities intersect. Certainly there's some emotional energy at those intersections. Sure, the neurochemistry beneath this energy helps transform curiosity into passion. But to really light that fire and ensure we're on the right track, you're going to need to amplify that passion with a series of public successes. A public success is nothing more than positive feedback from others. Any kind of social reinforcement increases feel-good neurochemistry, which increases motivation. Positive attention from others causes the brain to release more dopamine than we get from passion alone. It also adds oxytocin to the equation. The combination of dopamine and oxytocin rewards social interaction, creating the feelings of trust and love that are so critical for our survival. And the feel-good nature of this reward feeds back on itself, increasing our curiosity even more, which is the neurobiological feedback loop that forms the foundation of true passion. Thus, at this point in the process, it's time to make friends. But walk before you run. Taking things public doesn't require giving a TED Talk. Simple conversations with strangers will get things going. Walk into your neighborhood bar, start chatting with whomever sits next to you, and teach them about the stuff you've been teaching yourself. Then do it again. Talk to a different stranger, tell a few friends about your ideas, or join a meetup devoted to the subject. An online community, a book club, and if one doesn't exist, start your own. Finally, it's important to do these steps in order. You want to spend a bit of time playing around at the intersections of curiosities before taking this public. There's a lot of excitement that builds up as you start to investigate these intersections, but it's important to keep it to yourself for a bit. You want to enter any conversation with ideas of your own and something to say. There's nothing very fulfilling or passion-cultivating about being an absolute beginner. Knowing little often feels crappy. But being able to add something to the dialogue, having a few ideas of your own, and a few public successes built off those ideas, now you're approaching escape velocity. Transforming passion into purpose. Passion is a potent driver. Yet for all of its upside, passion can be a fairly selfish experience. Being all consumed means you're all consumed. There's not much room for other people. But if you're going to tackle the impossible, sooner or later you're going to need some outside assistance. Thus, at this point in the process, it's time to transform the fire of passion into the rocket fuel of purpose. It was University of Rochester psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan who first discovered this fuel. In the next chapter, we'll get to know these scientists and their work even better. For now, just be aware that, in the mid-1980s, this duo introduced self-determination theory, and with it, their concept of relatedness. Self-determination theory has since gone on to become the dominant theory in the science of motivation, with relatedness remaining a core component. Their original idea was simple. As social creatures, humans have an innate desire for connection and caring. We want to be connected to other people, and we want to care for other people. At a basic biological level, we need to relate to others to survive and thrive, and as a result, are neurochemically motivated to fulfill this need. More recently, researchers have extended this notion, expanding the idea of relatedness, the need for caring and connection, into the concept of purpose, or the desire for what we do to matter to other people. Purpose takes all the motivational energy found in passion and gives it an extra kick. Neurobiologically, purpose alters the brain. It decreases the reactivity of the amygdala, decreases the volume of the medial temporal cortex and increases the volume of the right insular cortex. A less reactive amygdala translates to less stress and greater resilience. The medial temporal cortex is involved in many aspects of perception, suggesting that having a purpose alters the way the brain filters incoming information, while a larger right insular cortex has been shown to protect against depression and correlate with a significant number of well-being measures. All of these changes seem to have a profound impact on our long-term health, as having a purpose in life, the technical term, has been shown to lower incidences of stroke, dementia, and cardiovascular disease. Additionally, from a performance standpoint, purpose boosts motivation, productivity, resilience, and focus. And it's a specific type of focus. Purpose shifts our attention off ourselves, internal focus, and puts it onto other people and the task at hand, external focus. In doing this, purpose guards against obsessive self-rumination, which is one of the root causes of anxiety and depression. By forcing you to look outside yourself, purpose acts as a force field. It protects you from yourself and the very real possibility of being swallowed whole by your new passion. To put this more technically, purpose seems to decrease the activity of the default mode network, which is the brain network in charge of rumination, and increase the activity of the executive attention network, which is the network that governs external focus. Finally, there's an even greater benefit to purpose. Outside assistance. Purpose acts as a rallying cry, inspiring others and attracting them to your cause. This has an obvious impact on drive. Social support provides even more neurochemistry, which produces an even greater boost in intrinsic motivation. More crucially, other people provide actual help. Financial, physical, intellectual, creative, emotional, they all matter. Simply put, on the road to impossible, we're going to need all the help we can get. Putting purpose into practice. Now for the practical concerns. When it comes to crafting your purpose, dream big. This is going to become the overarching mission statement for your life. Your capital I impossible. In our book Bold, Peter Diamandis and I introduced the concept of a massively transformative purpose, or MTP for short. Massively means large and audacious. Transformative means able to bring significant change to an industry, community, or the planet. And purpose? A clear why behind the work being done. An MTP is exactly the kind of big dream you're hunting. To hunt your MTP, take out another piece of paper. Pick up your pen again. Write down a list of 15 massive problems that you would love to see solved. Stuff that keeps you up at night. Hunger, poverty, or my personal favorite, protecting biodiversity. Again, try to be as specific as possible. Instead of just protecting biodiversity, take it a step further and add in the details. Establish mega-linkages to protect biodiversity. Next, look for spots where your core passion intersects with one or more of these grand, global challenges. A place where your personal obsession might be a solution to some collective problem. The overlap between passion and purpose, that's what you're hunting. If you can zero in on that target, you've found a way to use your newfound passion to do some real good in the world. That's a legitimate, massively transformative purpose. An MTP is both a crucial driver and a great foundation for a commercial enterprise. Don't sleep on this second detail. If you really want to cultivate your passion and purpose, you're always going to need a way to pay for that passion and purpose. But don't expect this to happen quickly, and find stopgap measures in the interim. I was a bartender for the first decade of my writing career which allowed me the time to develop my craft without the terror of having to pay my bills off the results. This was critical to my success. This is also why Tim Ferriss tells entrepreneurs to start out with a hobbyist approach to their first startup: nights and weekends. Curiosity into passion, passion into purpose, and purpose into patient profit. That's the safest way to play this game. But how to make sure you stay in the game long enough to achieve your purpose? That's exactly where we're going next. 3. The full intrinsic stack. Curiosity, passion, and purpose are a launching pad toward the impossible. They're the moves that get your pieces on the board, the place where this game begins. But the impossible is a long game, and if you're interested in seeing it through to the end, then the boost you'll get from these 3 initial drivers isn't nearly enough to carry you through. Toward those ends, we're going to take the drivers we examined in the last chapter, curiosity, passion, and purpose, and add autonomy and mastery to our stack. Both are exceptionally potent drivers, and both are biologically designed to work in conjunction with the previous stack. Autonomy is the desire for the freedom required to pursue your passion and purpose. It's the need to steer your own ship. Mastery is the next step. It drives you toward expertise. It pushes you to hone the skills you need to achieve your passion and purpose. In other words, if autonomy is the desire to steer your own ship, mastery is the drive to steer that ship well. And this is where Edward Deci and Richard Ryan return to our story. Our need for autonomy. In 1977, when Edward Deci and Richard Ryan were both young psychologists at the University of Rochester, they bumped into each other on campus. Deci had just become a clinical practitioner, and Ryan was still a grad student. They shared an interest in the science of motivation, which led to a long conversation, which led to a 50-year collaboration that overturned most of the foundational ideas in that science of motivation. Until Edward Deci and Richard Ryan pioneered self-determination theory, psychologists defined motivation as the energy required for action. Assessments were binary. A person either had the right amount of motivation for the job, or they didn't. Psychologists also viewed this motivational energy as a singular characteristic. You could measure quantity of motivation, the amount of motivation a person felt, but not quality or the type of motivation a person felt. Yet hints in the research had led Deci and Ryan to believe there were different types of motivation, and that different types of motivation produced different results. So they tested their ideas in head-to-head competition. In a lengthy series of experiments, they pitted intrinsic drivers, such as passion, against extrinsic drivers, such as prestige, and tallied the results. Very quickly they discovered that intrinsic motivation, a term that is synonymous with drive, is much more effective than extrinsic motivation in every situation excluding those where our basic needs haven't been met. But they also discovered that one of the more critical divisions was found between controlled motivation, a type of extrinsic motivation, and autonomous motivation, a form of intrinsic motivation. If you've been seduced, coerced, or otherwise pressured into doing something, that's controlled motivation. It's a job you have to do. Autonomous motivation is the opposite. It means you're doing what you're doing by choice. Deci and Ryan discovered that in every situation, autonomous motivation throttles controlled motivation. Autonomy is always the more powerful driver. In fact, in many situations, controlled motivation doesn't produce the desired results. When pressured into action, people routinely look for shortcuts. The example DC likes to give here is Enron. The energy company decided that the best way to motivate its employees was to give the best performers stock options, an example of motivation by seduction. But people quickly figured out that the best way to get those bonuses was to artificially inflate stock prices, committing corporate fraud and ultimately bankrupting the company. The history of Enron is often retold as a cautionary tale of greed and hubris, but it's really a story about how the wrong motivation can easily produce the wrong behaviors. According to DC and Ryan, we're tapping autonomy correctly when we're doing what we're doing because of interest and enjoyment, and because it aligns with our core beliefs and values. Put differently, the seeking system likes to be in charge of exactly what kinds of resources it's seeking. This is also why we started our exploration of drive with curiosity, passion, and purpose. This trilogy establishes interest and enjoyment via curiosity and passion, and then cements core beliefs and values via purpose. In other words, this trilogy of drivers came first in this book because it's the foundation required to maximize autonomy. Another thing DC and Ryan discovered is that autonomy turns us into a much more effective version of ourselves. The boost in neurochemistry provided by autonomy increases our drive, of course, but it also amplifies a host of additional skills. When we're steering our own ship, we're more focused, productive, optimistic, resilient, creative, and healthy. But if adding autonomy to our motivational stack is required to get this added boost in performance, this raises another question. How much autonomy do we actually need to add? 20% time. How much autonomy is required to capture the full power of this driver has been a tricky question to study. Yet there have been long series of living experiments on which to base our decisions. In these experiments, companies have tried to motivate employees by giving them autonomy as a benefit, with Google being the most famous example. Since 2004, Google has tapped autonomy as a driver with their 20% time, wherein Google engineers get to spend 20% of their time pursuing projects of their own creation, ones that align with their own core passion and purpose. And this experiment has produced incredible results. Over 50% of Google's largest revenue-generating products have come out of 20% time, including AdSense, Gmail, Google Maps, Google News, Google Earth, and Gmail Labs. But it wasn't Google who invented this practice. They actually borrowed it from 3M, whose own 15% rule dates back to 1948. In the case of 3M, engineers get to spend 15% of their time pursuing projects of their own devising. For a company with a research budget of over $1 billion, allowing employees the freedom to experiment with 15% of that amounts to an annual $150 million bet on autonomy. But as with Google, the products that have emerged from 3M's 15% rule have more than covered this bet. Post-it notes originated from 15% time back in 1974. This one product consistently generates over $1 billion a year in revenue, annually putting them $50 million in the black, which is quite an upside for their investment in autonomy. It's for this same reason that today Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple, and dozens of other companies have instituted autonomy programs of their own. But the more important point is what we learn from their examples. Google taps this driver with 20% time, meaning they're giving people 8 hours a week to pursue an idea about which they're passionate. Yet 3M gets amazing results from just 15% time, which is only about an afternoon a week. In other words, if you've already worked your way through the passion recipe and are now trying to figure out how to make room in your life to pursue that dream, these living experiments tell us you can get the results you desire by spending 4 to 5 hours a week devoted to your newfound purpose. In fact, as we'll see in the next section, the magic number of hours required to tap into autonomy might actually be less than that, provided those hours are spent in a very particular way. Patagonia's Big Four. The outdoor retailer Patagonia routinely ends up on lists of the best places to work in America. If you drill down into the particulars, employee autonomy is one of the most frequently cited reasons. But Patagonia isn't really giving their employees all that much autonomy. Instead, they're giving them very particular types of autonomy. Patagonia allows employees to make their own schedules. They still have to work full-time. They just get to decide when to work. Also, because the company is filled with outdoor athletes and their corporate headquarters sit right on the Pacific, whenever the waves are good, employees are allowed to stop working, even when they're on deadline, even if they're in the middle of a meeting, and go surfing. It's a corporate policy that Patagonia founder Yvon Chouinard famously dubbed, "Let my people go surfing." This combination tells us something critical about the amount of autonomy required to utilize this driver. If Patagonia's example holds true, then the answer is very little autonomy, provided that very little is well deployed. Let's examine the two categories at the center of their efforts: scheduling and surfing. Making your own schedule works well for two reasons. The first is sleep. The freedom to control your schedule gives you the best chance of getting a good night's rest. The research shows that we all need 7 to 8 hours of shut-eye a night. We'll explore this in further detail later, but here, know that without proper sleep, we experience a smorgasbord of performance deficits. Motivation, memory, learning, focus, reaction times, and emotional control all suffer. This is too big a list of detriments to overcome on a regular basis. Beyond a good night's rest, making your own schedule also lets you work in accordance with your circadian rhythms. Extreme larks, the technical term for very early risers, want to get down to business at 4 a.m., while night owls like to start their day at 4 p.m. But if we get out of sync with our innate biology, the penalty is attention and alertness. Thus, schedule autonomy allows people to get the sleep they need to be most effective, and allows people to work when they're most alert in order to maximize that effectiveness. Patagonia's other rule, the freedom to surf, provides two additional benefits. First, it prioritizes exercise. Second, it amplifies flow. We'll take them one at a time. Exercise is a non-negotiable for peak performance. You could fill a textbook with its benefits: health, energy, mood, and so on. But most critical here is nervous system regulation. Chasing any impossible can be an emotional roller coaster. If you can't regularly calm your nervous system, you'll crack up or burn out, or both. And exercise doesn't just reduce the level of stress hormones in our system, it replaces them with mood boosters like endorphins and anandamide. The calm optimism that results is critical for long-term peak performance. Yet surfing isn't only about prioritizing fitness. For reasons that we'll explore in the last section of this chapter, the sport has a high likelihood of driving participants into flow. The added push in feel-good neurochemistry the state provides is the real turbo boost. It's what shifts drive into overdrive, amplifying intrinsic motivation to optimal levels. So there's our answer. To get the boost and drive that autonomy provides, you need the freedom to control your sleep, work, and exercise schedule. You also need the autonomy to chase flow via an activity of your own choosing on a regular basis. Ideally, your work time will be devoted to activities that further your purpose, and the flow-producing activity is similar to surfing, meaning it's actually a break from work. If this isn't possible in your life today, start with the 3M plan. Devote 15% of your time to a project that aligns with your core passion and purpose. 15% is about an afternoon a week, though you can easily split this into a pair of 2.5-hour blocks and get similar results. And exactly how to spend those hours to get the very best results is where our last intrinsic driver comes into play. Our need for mastery. After DC and Ryan discovered the power of autonomy, they next wanted to know if this was our main intrinsic driver or if other factors were equally important. Trying to answer this question led them deep into the archives of psychology, where they uncovered a then relatively unknown 1953 paper by Harvard psychologist David McClelland. Titled The Achievement Motive, McClelland's paper has since become one of the most well-cited in the field. In it, he suggested a second intrinsic motivator that might be as powerful as autonomy, maybe more so. Initially, DC and Ryan borrowed McClelland's original term for the driver, competence, but we now know it as mastery. Mastery is the desire to get better at the things we do. It's devotion to craft, the need for progress, the urge to continually improve. Humans love nothing more than stacking little victory atop little victory atop little victory. Neurochemically, these victories produce dopamine. Scientists used to believe that dopamine was simply a reward drug, meaning this neurochemical showed up after we accomplished a goal as a way of reinforcing goal attainment. We now know that dopamine is actually the brain's way of encouraging us to act, meaning the chemical doesn't show up after we take a risk to reward our risk-taking. Rather, it arrives right before we take that risk to encourage our risk-taking. In other words, dopamine is the biological basis of exploration and innovation. When we work hard toward an important goal, that is, when we pursue mastery, dopamine levels spike. But the real victory is a series of these spikes, day after day after day. Emotionally, this series feels like momentum, which many peak performers describe as their very favorite sensation. The single biggest motivator, explains author Dan Pink in Drive, by far, is making progress in meaningful work. Of course, the opposite is also true. When progress is missing, the cost is steep. The sensation of being stuck in the mud, wheels spinning and not getting anywhere, is the single largest drain on motivation that scientists have discovered. If momentum is a peak performer's favorite feeling, then lack of momentum is their least favorite. Yet it's almost impossible to talk about mastery, momentum, and why this driver may be our single biggest motivator without discussing flow. And to aid in that discussion, it's helpful to meet psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and learn a little bit more about the history of the science of the state. Flow triggers. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is considered the godfather of flow psychology. In the years between 1970 and 1990, while first a professor in the University of Chicago Psychology Department and later its chairman, Csikszentmihalyi conducted a worldwide inquiry into flow and optimal performance. It was through this research that he determined that flow is a global phenomenon. The state is universal, showing up in anyone, anywhere, provided certain initial conditions are met. Originally, Csikszentmihalyi called these conditions proximal conditions for flow, but this has since been shortened to flow triggers, or preconditions that lead to more flow. To date, researchers have identified 22 different flow triggers. There are probably more, yet they all share one thing in common. Flow follows focus. The state can only arise when all of our attention is directed at the present moment. So that's exactly what all these triggers do. They drive attention into the now. From a neurobiological perspective, These triggers drive attention in one of three ways. Either they push dopamine and/or norepinephrine into our system, which are two of the brain's main focusing chemicals, and/or they lower cognitive load, which is the psychological weight of all the stuff we're thinking about at any one time. By lowering cognitive load, we're liberating energy, which the brain can then repurpose for paying attention to the task at hand. This is where curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery come back into this story. Our 5 most powerful intrinsic drivers do double duty as flow triggers. All 5 of these motivators can drive dopamine into our system. Many of them do the same for norepinephrine. And when all 5 are properly aligned, they lower cognitive load as well. From an evolutionary perspective, none of this is surprising. Drive is the psychological fuel that pushes us to obtain resources. Yet, we have the greatest chance of obtaining those resources if we have a plan for chasing them: curiosity, passion, purpose, the freedom to chase them, autonomy, and the skills required for that chase, mastery. If all these intrinsic drivers are not properly stacked, their misalignment becomes a persistent form of anxiety, which is the psychological weight of not doing exactly what we came here to do. When we get this motivational stack right, that weight lifts. Now we have way more energy with which to attack the task at hand, and a much greater chance of getting into flow along the way. Even better, almost all of this happens automatically. When we're curious, passionate, and purposeful, cognitive load lightens and dopamine and norepinephrine flow into our system. The same is true for autonomy, but this is not true for mastery. While curiosity, passion, purpose, and autonomy alter our neurobiology automatically, both increasing drive and, as a result of the changes in neurochemistry that produce that increase in drive, increasing our chance of getting into flow, mastery requires some additional fine-tuning. As a flow trigger, mastery is referred to as the challenge-skills balance. The idea is relatively straightforward. Flow follows focus, and we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. We want to stretch, but not snap. When we are pushing on our talents and advancing our abilities, we are walking the path to mastery, and the brain notices. It rewards this effort with dopamine. And because dopamine enhances focus even more, this increases our chances of getting into flow, and the cycle continues. An example might be helpful. I'm a skier. I started skiing when I was 5 years old and have never stopped. As a result, every time I head into the mountains, I am making a choice, autonomy, that is aligned with my passion and purpose. As a result of this result, simply laying edge on snow will lower my cognitive load and produce a little dopamine and norepinephrine. If, when I'm out skiing, I decide to go explore a part of the mountain I've not seen before, now I've layered curiosity atop those other motivators and added a little more neurochemistry to the equation. While I might not yet be in flow, enough of my attention is focused on the task at hand, the skiing, to be moving me in the right direction. To push myself over the top, what I need to do is something that drives me into the challenge skills sweet spot. I could head into the terrain park and start practicing a new trick, perhaps. Or I could find that steep, skinny chute that, on my last trip through, required 5 turns to ski down, and today I'll try to ski it in 4 turns. By doing either, I've upped the challenge level a little bit, and my brain rewards that risk-taking effort with even more dopamine. Suddenly, there's enough neurochemistry in my system to push me into flow. Yet this isn't the end of the story. The state itself produces an even greater cascade of feel-good neurochemistry. Thus, my deep love for skiing gets even deeper, and the next time I head into the mountains, my desire to repeat these actions and try to improve my skills yet again is significantly amplified, with no extra effort required. If I do this a few times in a row, what used to require energy and exertion begins to happen automatically. Seeking out that challenge skills sweet spot has become a habit. Now I'm automatically walking the path toward mastery, which is also the only path that can lead us to the impossible. Finally, all of this translates into some extremely practical advice. To really harness mastery as a motivator, take the 15% of your life that you've carved out for yourself, call it your autonomy time, and spend it pushing on that challenge skills balance, trying to get a little better at something that's aligned with curiosity, passion, and purpose. Start chasing the high of incremental improvement. Get hooked on the dopamine loop of advancement. Try to get a little better today, try to get a little better tomorrow. And repeat, and repeat. And there's really no choice in the matter. Earlier, when I said these 5 intrinsic drivers were biologically related, I meant that they are all designed to work together as a sequence. This is also why, when properly sequenced, these drivers so reliably produce flow. We are all designed for optimal performance. This is how the system wants to work, and there are serious consequences for trying to buck the system. Both disconnection from meaningful values and disconnection from meaningful work are major causes of anxiety and depression. Disconnection from meaningful values is a lack of curiosity, passion, and purpose in your life. Disconnection from meaningful work is about being forced to do work, a lack of autonomy, that is boring or overwhelming and does not advance core skills, a lack of mastery. This is yet another reason why it's so crucial to get our biology to work for us rather than against us, because the failure to do this work carries serious psychological penalties. But if we can align these 5 major intrinsic motivators, the result is amplified motivation and increased flow, which means, on the long road toward impossible, we'll go farther, faster. Yet, since we're now going to be moving through our lives at greater speeds, it's increasingly important that we know exactly where we want to go, which is exactly why we need to turn our attention to the topic of goals. 4. Goals. Goal Setting 101. If intrinsic drivers are about creating the psychological energy required to push us forward, goals tell us exactly where we want to go. We started the process of identifying our goals in Chapter 1, when we created our massively transformative purpose, or what could be considered a mission statement for our lives. Here we want to break that mission statement down into smaller chunks, dividing up the impossible into a long series of difficult but doable goals that, if accomplished, render said impossible much more probable. This is not a new idea. Over 2,000 years ago, the philosopher Aristotle noticed that setting goals, that is, the establishment of a desired outcome or target, was one of the primary motivators of human behavior. He called goals one of the 4 foundational causes or big drivers of change in the world. It was a groundbreaking insight, but one that's taken us a very long time to understand. The issue is complexity. Simple as the idea of goal setting might seem, there's trouble in the particulars. What the research shows is that not every goal is the same, nor is every goal appropriate for every situation, and, most important, the wrong goal in the wrong situation can seriously hinder performance and actually lower productivity and motivation. Let's start with the science. During the late 1960s, University of Toronto psychologist Gary Latham and University of Maryland psychologist Edwin Locke, considered the godfathers of goal-setting theory, fleshed out Aristotle's notion and gave us an idea that we now hold as truth. The establishment of a goal is one of the easiest ways to increase motivation and enhance performance. Back then, though, this was something of a surprising finding. Latham and Locke came at this topic organizationally. They were interested in what companies could do to motivate employees to work harder. Prior to the 1960s, the general consensus was that happy workers were productive workers. Thus, putting more stress on employees by establishing performance targets, that is, goals, was considered bad for business. But Latham and Locke did something other theorists had not. They conducted experiments. And the idea that more stress equals less work was definitely not what their data showed. Latham and Locke started with lumberjacks, a ferociously independent bunch of study subjects. The lumberjacks were divided into teams. Some teams were told to work smart and fast, but no pressure, do your best. Others were given quotas. This much wood for a good week of work, this much wood for a great week. It's important to note that there was a zero financial reward given for meeting these targets. The goals were simply set, and that was the end of it. Yet, time and again, the lumberjacks who had been given targets to aim for ended up gathering far more wood than the controls. And it's not just lumberjacks. In dozens of studies in dozens of fields, Latham and Locke found that setting goals increased performance and productivity 11 to 25%. That's a fairly extraordinary boost. At the upper end, if an 8-hour day is our baseline, that's like getting 2 extra hours of work for free simply by building a mental frame, that is, a goal, around the activity. Another way to think about Locke and Latham's ideas about goal setting is as a subcomponent to Ryan and Deasy's work. As Richard Ryan later wrote, human needs, such as autonomy, mastery, and purpose, provide the energy for behavior. People value goals because the goals are expected to provide satisfaction of their needs. In other words, the need for autonomy is what drives people to start their own business. Goals, meanwhile, are all the individual steps required to actually be in business. To understand the power of goals, we also need to understand how they impact brain function. The brain is a prediction engine. It's always trying to predict what is about to happen next and how much energy will be required by that situation. To make those predictions, 3 systems come into play: information acquisition, pattern recognition, and goal direction. We take in information, find connections between this information and prior experience, and then filter those results through our goals to decide what to do next. And since that decision is an action, and actions require energy, how much energy exactly? That is exactly what the brain is always trying to predict. And all of these systems work in concert. Give the goal direction system a goal, and you give the pattern recognition system a purpose, and the information acquisition system a target. And why does this target matter so much? Because consciousness is an extremely limited resource. Every second, millions of bits of information flood into our senses. Yet the human brain can only handle about 7 bits of information at once, and the shortest time it takes to discriminate one set of bits from another is 1/18th of a second. By using these figures, as Csikszentmihalyi explained in Flow, one concludes that it is possible to process at most 126 bits of information per second. That's not a lot of information. To understand what another person is saying takes about 40 bits. If 3 people are talking at once, we're maxed out. All other incoming information is invisible to us. But it's not just other people talking that we miss noticing. The vast majority of everything happening in the world falls into this category. The system is constantly overloaded, so much of reality is constantly invisible. Much of what remains visible is simply the stuff that scares us. Evolution shaped the brain for survival, so anything that could threaten that survival always grabs our attention. But what else is important for our survival? Our goals, and anything that can help us achieve those goals. Because the brain is a prediction engine, and consciousness is a limited resource, fear and goals are the basic building blocks of our reality. This is the foundational neurobiology. But what DC and Ryan discovered is that there's an order to this process. For goals to be most effective at shaping perception, there's a requisite first step. We need to know our needs, that is, our intrinsic motivations, before we can utilize goals as a way of fulfilling those needs. That's why this book started where it did. With passion and purpose properly stacked atop autonomy and mastery, we're now positioned to get the maximum benefit from goal setting. Yet, as Latham once told me, not every goal is the same. We found that if you want the largest increase in motivation and productivity, then big goals lead to the best outcomes. Big goals significantly outperform small goals, medium-sized goals, and vague goals. Big goals. That's the secret. But what exactly is a big goal? The importance of high, hard goals. High, hard goals is the technical term for Latham and Locke's big goals. These are different from the massively transformative purposes we've already discussed. MTPs are along the lines of discover sustainable ways to end world hunger, while a high, hard goal, HHG, is a major step along that path, such as get a degree in nutrition, or create a nonprofit that uses insect-based proteins to feed the world in a more sustainable fashion. On the way to impossible, you're going to need both MTPs and HHGs, and we'll start with the former. If you work the steps of the passion recipe correctly, you most likely came out the other side of that exercise with 2 or 3 core passion/purpose combinations. This is the sketch outline for an MTP. Now all that's required is to turn those ideas into core mission statements. An example might be useful. In my own life, I have 3 MTPs. Write books that have a deep impact, advance the science and training of flow, and make the world a better place for animals. That's it. Those 3 goals function as the mission statement for my life. This also means that these goals are my first filter. If a project comes my way, if it doesn't advance these 3 missions, then it's not for me. This is critical. It doesn't do much good to do all this work to increase motivation, only to squander it on the frivolous. MTPs, utilized properly, aren't aspirational, they're filtrational. They weed out the work that doesn't matter. High, hard goals, then, are all these sub-steps that can help you accomplish these larger missions. These too are key. HHGs jack up both attention and persistence, which are 2 factors critical for sustained peak performance. And they're critical because high, hard goals are, as advertised, difficult mountains to climb. The grind is real. That's another reason why that extra attention and persistence matter. Yet, not so fast. For high, hard goals to really work their magic, Locke and Latham discovered that certain moderators, the word psychologists use to describe if-then conditions, need to be in place. One of the most important of these is commitment. You have to believe in what you're doing, explains Latham. Big goals work best when there's an alignment between an individual's values and the desired outcome of the goal. When everything lines up, we're totally committed, meaning we're paying even more attention, are even more resilient, and are way more productive as a result. This is also why this primer started with passion and purpose. Big goals work best when we're passionate about the subject of the goal, the idea that surrounds it, and its end result, the bigger purpose the goal serves. If you followed this book in order, then you added autonomy and mastery into your stack of drivers before you started setting HHGs. This sequence ensures that Locke and Latham's if-then conditions are met, that values, needs, and dreams are aligned with the goals we're setting. and that as a result, we get the maximum boost in performance. Equally important to this approach, keep your goals to yourself. While Latham and Locke originally believed that making your goal public increased motivation, a series of additional studies by NYU psychologist Peter Gollwitzer showed that talking about a goal significantly lessens your chances of achieving it. By giving voice to an aim, you're creating what's called a social reality, and this has negative consequences for real reality. The act of telling someone about your goal gives you the feeling that the goal's already been achieved. It releases the dopamine you're supposed to get afterward, prematurely. And with that neurochemistry comes the feeling of satisfaction. This is the issue. Once you've already felt that high, it's difficult to get back up for the hard fight required to actually earn it. As the saying goes, real bad boys move in silence. Most important, momentum matters most. High, hard goals need to be challenging, but attainable. If you're always stressed out about how hard your goal is to achieve, then you'll wear yourself out long before you can achieve it. Plus, the real aim is self-efficacy, that fundamental increase in capability and possibility, the new and improved version of yourself that you get to become after achieving your goals. Clear goals. Clear goals is where goal setting gets even trickier. Turns out there are significant differences between high, hard goals and clear goals, which are all the daily sub-steps required to accomplish those high, hard goals. It comes down to timescale. High, hard goals are our longer missions, the ones that can take years to achieve. They're the big steps toward our big dreams. I want to write a book, or become a doctor, or start a company. These are all high, hard goals. Clear goals are the inverse. They're all the tiny daily steps it takes to accomplish that mission. They exist over much smaller timescales. Becoming a great writer is a massively transformative purpose, or a goal to aim for over a lifetime. Writing a novel is the next level down, a high, hard goal that could take years to complete. Writing 500 words between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., now, that's a clear goal. Writing 500 words between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. that produce a feeling of excitement in the reader, now, that's an even clearer goal. So what does this look like in the real world? Daily to-do lists. A proper to-do list is just a set of clear goals for your day. At a very basic level, this is exactly what the road to impossible looks like. A well-crafted to-do list, executed daily. Each item on that list originated with your massively transformative purpose, was chunked down into a high, hard goal, then further reduced to what you can do today to advance that cause. A clear goal is a tiny mission. As DC and Ryan first discovered, if this tiny mission is properly aligned with core values, it gives you the motivational burst needed to get after it. And once accomplished, you get the dopamine reward on the other side, which cements your desire to get after it tomorrow. Stacking little win atop little win atop little win is always the road toward victory. Equally crucial, clear goals are an important flow trigger. The state requires focus, and clear goals tell us where and when to put our attention. When goals are clear, the mind doesn't have to wonder about what to do or what to do next. It already knows. Thus, concentration tightens, motivation heightens, and extraneous information gets filtered out. In a sense, clear goals act as a priority list for the brain, lowering cognitive load and telling the system where to expend its energy. Applying this idea in our daily life means breaking tasks into bite-sized chunks and setting goals accordingly. Think challenging yet manageable. Just enough stimulation to shortcut attention into the now, not enough stress to pull you back out again. A proper, clear goal sits right inside your challenge skill sweet spot, meaning it's hard enough to stretch you to the edge of your abilities, but not hard enough to push you beyond, into that demotivating realm of anxiety and overwhelm. Taken together, what all this means is that proper goal setting requires 3 sets of goals: massively transformative, high and hard, and clear, for 3 different timescales. MTPs last a lifetime. High hard goals can take years, while clear goals are accomplished 1 minute at a time. But it also means knowing which goal to focus on when. Across these shorter timescales of the moment, attention needs to be on the task at hand, the clear goal, and not the reason for doing the task, the high hard goal or MTP. Getting this wrong can actually block flow, depriving goal setters of the very boost in performance they'll need to achieve those goals. When it comes to writing up your daily to-do lists, try to write the next day's list at the end of the previous day. That way, you can get after it the moment you get to work. Personally, I limit the number of items on my to-do lists to around 8, which is my maximum capacity for a good day's work. In other words, on any given day, I have the energy to push myself into that challenge skills sweet spot 8 times. So I don't try for 9 or 10 or 11, because then I'm overloaded. Nor do I shirk the work and try for 6 or 7. But that's me. Figure out what works best for you. Conduct your own experiment. Track how many things you can do in a day and still be your best at all of them. Do this every day for a few weeks, and you'll light upon the magic number. That's how many items you should put on your daily list of clear goals. By getting this right, we maximize motivation, but we also know when to declare the day a success. For me, if I tick off all 8 items on my daily to-do list, then I've won my day. It's done. I can turn off my brain and recover. This is important. Recovery is critical to sustained peak performance. But peak performers can become a little obsessive, getting into workaholic mode and never getting out. So knowing how to stop working without feeling bad about stopping is key for long-term success. It's not just that you need to recover. It's that feeling bad about taking the time to recover, even if you are taking the time, actually hampers recovery. Worse, those negative feelings further impact performance, lowering motivation, scattering focus, and blocking flow. The big point: impossible is always a checklist. Do every item on your checklist today, do every item on your checklist tomorrow, and repeat. This is how clear goals become high, hard achievements, which become milestones on the way to massively transformative purposes. Yet there's no hiding from the truth. Even if you're winning your days and making noticeable progress toward your goals, the need to endlessly repeat this process demands persistence and resilience. And this explains where we're going next, straight into grit. 5. Grit. No pressure, no diamonds. No pressure, no diamonds. Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle said this 300 years ago. It was true then, it's still true now. What Carlyle means is excellence has a cost. The challenge of sustained high performance is the grind. So even if you harness the full suite of intrinsic drivers and turbo boost the results with proper goal setting, it's still not going to be enough. And this is exactly why grit matters so much. Grit is motivation writ large, not just the energy it takes to push through a difficult task, but the energy needed to push through years of difficult tasks. Without the ability to tough out the hard times, you'll rarely get anywhere worth going. Think of it this way. Intrinsic motivation launches you down the path of peak performance. Proper goal setting helps define that path, and grit is what keeps you keeping on, despite the odds and obstacles. Yet most people think of grit as a single skill. We say, "She's a gritty athlete," or "He's a gritty scientist," as if that explained everything. The actual truth is a little more complicated. When psychologists describe grit, they often lean upon University of Pennsylvania psychologist Angela Duckworth's definition of the trait: the intersection of passion and perseverance. Yet, as helpful as this definition is, it may not take us far enough. If you speak to peak performers, they often describe 6 different types of perseverance that they regularly train. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Next up, the neuroscientists. When neuroscientists talk about grit, their discussion focuses on the prefrontal cortex, or the part of the brain that sits right behind the forehead. The prefrontal cortex controls most of our higher cognitive functions, including both goal-directed behavior and self-regulation. The term goal-directed behavior covers all the different actions required to accomplish one's goals. Self-regulation sits downstream from here. It's how we feel and what we do with those feelings on our way to accomplishing those goals. In other words, self-regulation is both the ability to control our emotions and the ability to persist through challenging, strenuous tasks. Neurobiologically, these 2 attributes are our recipe for grit. In functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI studies, these attributes show up in a very particular way. People who have trouble with grit have a higher amount of spontaneous, resting state activity in their right dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. Grittier people have less. This part of the brain helps govern both self-regulation and long-term planning. But to understand why it quiets down in gritty people, we also need to know more about the relationship between dopamine and persistence. In the last chapter, we learned that whenever we accomplish a hard task, dopamine is our reward. In this chapter, we want to build on this idea, seeing that if we accomplish hard tasks over and over again, the brain starts to connect the feeling of persistence with the dopamine reward to come. We're making the act of tapping into our emotional reservoirs a habit. This automatization may be the reason that the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex stays quiet in gritty people. Once the emotional fortitude required for digging deep becomes a habit, we can dig deep without having to think about it. So the part of the brain required to think about it doesn't have to get involved. What does it take to train up these resilient reward loops? If you ask peak performers this question, they don't answer it like the scientists. Psychologists tend to talk about the intersection of passion and perseverance. Neuroscientists focus on the prefrontal cortex. Yet elite performers cast a much wider net. If you ask them this question, you get 6 different answers. 6 types of grit that peak performers regularly work to improve. For sustained high performance and high achievement, you'll need all 6. And there are no shortcuts. Each of these grit skills has to be trained up independently. We'll take them one at a time. The grit to persevere. In 1869, Sir Francis Galton undertook the first study of grit and high achievement. In a lengthy historical analysis, he examined standouts in the fields of politics, sport, art, music, and science, looking for traits that accounted for their success. While he found that high achievers all seemed to possess an unusual amount of talent, which he thought might be innate, i.e. genetic, this wasn't enough to explain their actual achievements. Instead, he lit on 2 characteristics that mattered more: zeal and capacity for hard labor. It's been over 150 years, and nobody has yet to prove Galton wrong, though we have updated his terminology. In the early 2000s, Angela Duckworth replaced zeal with passion, and capacity for hard labor with perseverance. It's the combination she famously calls grit. In a series of studies, Duckworth discovered that this combination was twice as important to academic success as IQ. And what is true for academics is true for a host of additional fields, which is to say, as Duckworth says, all high achievers are paragons of perseverance. Perseverance is the most familiar version of grit. It's day-to-day steadfastness, the kind of persistence that lets you tough it out no matter the circumstance. Kick me in the teeth or sing my praises, doesn't matter, I'm still here. This is why I have a sign above my desk reading, "Do the hard thing," and why the Navy SEALs trumpet, "Embrace the suck," as their unofficial motto. Yet, lost in this tough talk is a soft underbelly. Psychologists have found that humans can achieve 3 levels of well-being on this planet, each more pleasurable than the last. The first level is moment-to-moment happiness, or what's often described as a hedonic approach to life. The next level up is engagement, which is defined as a high-flow lifestyle, or one where happiness is achieved not by the pursuit of pleasure, but rather through seeking out challenging tasks that have a high likelihood of producing flow. The next level up, the peak level of happiness, and the best we get to feel on this planet, is known as purpose, which blends the high-flow lifestyle of level 2 with the desire to impact lives beyond our own. In a study of nearly 16,000 subjects, Angela Duckworth and Yale psychologist Catherine von Kuhlen found a clear link between grit and what level of happiness people pursue. Less gritty people hunt happiness through pleasure, while grittier folks choose engagement. Yet by consistently choosing engagement and triggering flow, the grittier folks are actually getting more happiness, not less. Thus, while grit requires more energy and emotional fortitude in the short run, it provides a much bigger boost in mood and motivation in the long run. My bet? This isn't new information. Think back over your life. Think about your proudest accomplishments. Now think about how hard you worked to accomplish them. Sure, everybody gets lucky a few times. There's always a handful of occasions when you get exactly what you want without having to work very hard to achieve it. But are those the memories that brought you the most happiness? The ones that provided actual optimism and confidence in your future? The ones that significantly boosted your long-term performance? Doubtful. We humans like gritty hard work, because gritty hard work provides better long-term survival benefits. And if we can tap into that drive, we can fundamentally change the quality of our life. But there's a rub. Even this version of grit is more nuanced than many suspect. When researchers tease persistence apart, they actually find 3 psychological traits: willpower, mindset, and passion. Again, there are no shortcuts. You need all 3 for sustained high performance. Willpower. Willpower is self-control. It's the ability to resist distraction, stay focused, and delay gratification. It's also a finite resource. How much of a finite resource? That's an open question. Research conducted by psychologist Roy Baumeister linked willpower levels to energy levels, which helps explain why our willpower erodes as the day goes on. People trying to lose weight, for example, often find they can stay on their diets until nighttime, then succumb to a temptation tub of ice cream before bed. This also explains decision fatigue, or the fact that, when forced to solve a series of hard problems, the quality of our solutions deteriorates over time. Baumeister's research has become the subject of some healthy debate, especially because he directly linked energy levels to glucose levels. But this detail is less important. If you talk to peak performers, most agree that willpower declines over the course of the day. Maybe this is just a normal drop in energy levels, or maybe it's directly related to what Baumeister termed ego depletion. In either case, peak performers fight back with scheduling. If willpower degenerates over time, don't argue. Just start your day with your hardest task and work backward. in descending order of importance and difficulty to the easiest. The business catchphrase for this approach is, "Eat your ugly frog first," though it's roughly the same procedure we should use for putting an order around our clear goals list. Always start your clear goals list, and thus your day, by attacking the task that, once accomplished, will produce the biggest win for that day. Of course, since willpower declines over time, those second and third frogs can become the bigger issue. This is also why I have that sign above my desk reading, "Do the hard thing." The phrase is a great reminder to attack life's challenges, but its real function is much smaller. It's to remind me to do one extra item on my to-do list before I take my first break. If my day's first task is to add 750 words to whatever book I'm writing, and the second one is to practice a speech, my sign reminds me to practice that speech before I take my first break. This helps me push through my tougher tasks while I still have the maximum energy for that push. There are caveats, of course. When we're tired, we see decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, and this leads to serious performance deficits. Attention wavers, cognition slows, and processing errors arrive with increasing frequency. Creativity takes a bigger hit. When we're low on energy, we don't bother seeking far-flung connections among ideas. We take the easiest choice available, never mind the consequences. What this means? If you're fighting a battle against lack of sleep, don't fight one over willpower at the same time. Finally, once the dust settles around the glucose debate, I think we're going to find that boosting energy levels with food, Baumeister's intervention, can help reset willpower, yet there will always be some state shifting required. If you talk to peak performers about resetting willpower midday, they'll talk about eating for certain, Baumeister's suggestion. But naps, meditation, and exercise are frequently mentioned as well. All of these latter interventions don't just reset our physiology, they shift our state and reset our neurobiology, which seems to be another critical piece in this puzzle. Mindset. Mindset is what my friend Peter Diamandis means by, if you think you can, or you think you can't, well, you're right. More technically, mindset refers to our attitudes toward learning. Either you have a fixed mindset, meaning you believe talent is innate and no amount of practice will ever help you improve, or you have a growth mindset, meaning you believe talent is merely a starting point and practice makes all the difference. And for sustained perseverance, the research shows that a growth mindset is indispensable. When Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck scanned the brains of people tackling tasks too difficult for them, she found a substantial difference in reactions between fixed and growth mindsetters. When faced with a hard problem, the brains of fixed mindsetters show a total lack of activity, as if their mindset were filtering out all incoming information. Since fixed mindsetters believe talent is innate, they didn't believe they could solve the problem. As a result, their brains didn't bother expending the energy to try. The problem, quite literally, didn't register. On the flip side, when faced with a difficult challenge, the brains of growth mindsetters showed a lot of fireworks. Their whole brain lit up and stayed that way, and with significant results. Growth mindsetters work harder, longer, and smarter, deploying a much wider range of problem-solving strategies when facing complicated challenges. They also have an easier time getting into and staying in flow. This uptick in flow comes down to concentration. When fixed mindsetters make an error, they tend to dwell on it. This wrecks their ability to keep their focus in the here and now. Not so for growth mindsetters. Live and learn, says the growth mindset, and more flow is the result. So the critical question is, how to cultivate a growth mindset? Curiosity is the first step. If you're asking questions and learning, it's hard to tell yourself that learning itself is not possible. Next, To build on this foundation, inventory your personal history. Make a list of your skills, whatever they may be. Mostly it's not the skills themselves that matter. It's the fact that you learned them in the first place that you're trying to recognize. Be very specific. Unearth invisible skills. What's an invisible skill? Know how to defuse an argument? It's a talent that doesn't show up on an aptitude test, but one that's fantastically useful in the real world. Once your list is complete, backtrack everything on it. Deconstruct your abilities. How did you learn this skill? What did you learn first, second, third, and so on? Do the same for all your other skills. Look for commonalities. If you find overlaps in your framework, this will give you a sense of how you learn. It will also force you to realize that you can learn, often in difficult circumstances, often without noticing. This is the key shift. Once we believe we can learn, we can become curious about what else we can learn, and suddenly we're deploying our growth mindset on a regular basis and for maximum benefit. Passion. We started this primer by exploring passion, but it's necessary to pick up the thread again. Passion matters in a discussion of grit, because there's no other way to persevere for years on end. Working until 3 in the morning for 3 months straight gets old quickly. This is why author John Irving's advice on persistence is blunt and straightforward. Get obsessed, stay obsessed. Unfortunately, his advice doesn't always help. The problem? Genuine passion doesn't look like genuine passion on the front end. When most of us think about the poster child for passion, we imagine LeBron James hard-scowling his way to some backboard-rattling thunder dunk, or Einstein, wild-haired at the blackboard, brain rattling off equations. We see fire in the belly, sweat upon the brow, and think, well, that's just not me. But it just wasn't them either. And that's the point. Early-stage passion doesn't look like late-stage passion. For LeBron, early-stage passion looked exactly like what it was: a little kid standing in front of a big hoop, trying to get his shots to drop. On the front end, passion is nothing more than the overlap of multiple curiosities coupled to a few wins. So yeah, the ultimate goal may be to get obsessed, stay obsessed. But our journey begins with get curious, stay curious. A second point is worth mentioning. Passion isn't always pleasant. Quite often, passion feels like frustration on the inside and looks like obsession from the outside. Peak performers must learn to tolerate enormous amounts of anxiety and overwhelm, which is what passion feels like much of the time. Passion doesn't make us gritty. Passion makes us able to tolerate all the negative emotions produced by grit. A growth mindset allows us to see this tolerance for negativity as a sign of victory. It helps flip the script, forcing the brain to reframe pain as pleasure. What also helps? A clear goals list. Every time you ignore the frustration, delay the gratification, and cross an item off that list, that's a little win. The small rush of pleasure you feel when you cross off an item is the reward chemical dopamine. Passion produces little wins produce dopamine, and dopamine repeatedly over time cements a growth mindset into place. But because neurochemicals play a lot of different roles in the brain, this increase in dopamine also amplifies focus and drives flow. And flow, over time, produces grit. The reason? The ecstasy of flow redeems the agony of passion. If flow is our reward for perseverance, because flow is such a gargantuan reward, we're willing to tolerate a lot of pain along the way. But it's still a lot of pain. This is why, even if you can properly utilize willpower, motivation, and passion, training this kind of gritty perseverance requires, well, training. And most experts agree, when it comes to perseverance, there's little substitute for the physical. Work out. Engage in regular exercise. Ski, surf, or snowboard. Ride a bike. Go for walks. Lift weights. Run. Do yoga. Do tai chi. Whatever. Do something. It's that simple. Okay, perhaps not exactly that simple. Feedback matters. Measure your progress, and every time you work out, push a little harder than the last. Stay in the challenge skills sweet spot. Aim for those dopamine-producing, small, incremental victories. Also, prepare for failure. There will be times when working out is impossible. You're too tired or too busy, or both. It's bound to happen. On the days when the suck embraces you, more than the other way around, have a plan in place. If you can't get in your full workout in the morning, then have a pre-planned half workout scheduled for the afternoon. And for those days when nothing seems possible, create a low-energy grit exercise. If you're too tired to do anything else, this low-grit exercise is what you do. My version is 200 push-ups. My longtime editor, Michael Wharton, prefers a 20-minute run. The point is to find something hard enough to remind yourself that you're gritty enough to get it done, especially when you can't do much else. That reminder is the point. Over time, it's what automatizes persistence. The grit to control your thoughts. Impossible. You can hear the frustration built in, the hard work, the long hours, the voice in your head telling you to quit, the beating of your head against hard surfaces. Maybe that's only me, but you get the point. If you're interested in being your best, your inner monologue needs to support the best you want to be. In fact, when it comes to sustained performance, because doubt and disappointment are constant companions, controlling your thoughts is often the ballgame. At the elite level, explains high-performance psychologist Michael Gervais, talent and ability are mostly equal. The difference is in the head. High performance is 90% mental, and most of that mental edge comes from being able to control your thoughts. My favorite big-picture thinking on this subject comes from author David Foster Wallace's amazing speech, "This is Water." Originally given as a commencement address at Kenyon College in 2005, "This is Water" is ostensibly about the value of a liberal arts education, but is actually about the dire necessity of thought control. Here's Wallace. 20 years after my own graduation, I have come gradually to understand that the liberal arts cliché about teaching you how to think is actually shorthand for a much deeper, more serious idea. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to, and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. And I submit that this is what the real, no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperially alone, day in and day out. That may sound like hyperbole or abstract nonsense. Let's get concrete. There happen to be whole, large parts of adult American life that nobody talks about in commencement speeches. One such part involves boredom, routine, and petty frustration. The parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. Excellence requires repetition. Even if you've got passion and purpose perfectly aligned and completely love what you do is often reduced to a daily checklist. This means a portion of peak performance is always sculpted out of Wallace's hallmarks of adult life: boredom, routine, and petty frustration. This is why thought control matters. Without the grit to control your thoughts, the boredom and frustration that come with every routine will quickly spiral downward. A great many peak performers eventually come to a very uncomfortable realization. They're doing exactly what they love, yet completely hating their life. This is a whole new level of difficult. If passion and purpose become a prison, petty frustration morphs into blind rage. It's the thing no one tells you about following your dreams. Sooner or later, you're going to follow them right off a cliff. Point of fact: David Foster Wallace took his own life a few years after penning This Is Water. His wonderful speech remains a tragic reminder of the truly difficult nature of winning this fight. The better news is that science has begun paying attention to this problem. Over the past few decades, mental hygiene has become a hot topic. Progress has been swift. A three-pronged approach has been uncovered. We'll go one prong at a time. Self-talk. If you want to control your thoughts, positive self-talk is the place to start. There are only two kinds of thoughts, explains Michael Gervais, those that constrict us or those that expand us. Negative thoughts constrict, positive thoughts expand. And you can feel the difference. We're looking to expand. Positive self-talk is about choosing those thoughts that provide a little more space. Constricting thoughts are along the lines of, "This sucks. I can't handle this. Why is my life so unfair?" They shrink your options and abilities. Positive thoughts move in the other direction. "I choose to be here. I've got this. I can definitely rise to this occasion." Yet, for this to really work, you'll need a lot more positive self-talk than you might assume. University of North Carolina's Barbara Fredrickson discovered the positivity ratio, or the fact that it takes 3 positive thoughts to counter a single negative thought. 3 to 1, she wrote in a recent journal article, is the ratio we found to be the tipping point beyond which the full impact of positive emotions becomes unleashed. Once unleashed, the impact is considerable. Positive self-talk leads to positive emotions, which expand perspective, giving us the ability to create action plans beyond our normal routines. These new action plans alleviate the boredom and frustration that come with the checklist. Better still, positive emotions drive the bounce-back effect, which is a fancy term for resilience. One thing to know: positive self-talk has to be grounded in reality. When we try to bolster ourselves with false claims, the brain is not fooled. We're excellent at detecting the mismatch between self-fact and self-fiction. This is why affirmations tend to backfire. If you're telling yourself you're a millionaire, but actually work at Walmart, the brain knows. We find the disparity between the affirmation's fantasy and our actual reality too big, and the result is demotivating. The best way to talk yourself up is to remind yourself of stuff you know is true. If there have been times when you faced similar challenges and succeeded, that's where to start. Actual information trumps New Age aspiration every time. Gratitude. Our senses gather 11 million bits of information every second. This is way too much for the brain to handle. So much of what the brain does is sift and sort, trying to tease apart the critical from the casual. And since the first order of business for any organism is survival, the first filter most of that information encounters is the amygdala, our threat detector. Unfortunately, to keep us safe, the amygdala is strongly biased toward negative information. We're always hunting danger. In experiments run at the University of California, Berkeley, psychologists discovered that we take in as many as 9 bits of negative information for every positive bit that gets through. 9 to 1 are lousy odds under the best of conditions, and peak performance rarely takes place under the best of conditions. Yet, negative thinking leads to heightened stress. This crushes optimism and squelches creativity. When tuned toward the negative, we miss the novel. Novelty is the foundation for pattern recognition, and by extension, the basis of creativity. No creativity, no innovation. No innovation, no impossible. Positive self-talk is one solution to this problem. Gratitude is another. A daily gratitude practice alters the brain's negativity bias. It changes the amygdala's filter, essentially training it to take in more positive information. This works so well because the positive stuff you're grateful for is stuff that has already happened. It never trips our bullshit detector. The best time for a gratitude practice is an open question. Personally, I like to do mine at the end of my workday, right after I've written up my next day's clear goals list. But on days when I wake up stressed, it's the first thing I'll do, while the coffee is brewing, right before I start my morning writing session. And there are two ways to approach a gratitude practice. Option 1. Write down 10 things you're grateful for, and each time you write an item down, really take the time to feel that gratitude. You're trying to recall the somatic address of the emotion, discovering where it lives in the body, your gut, your head, your heart, and exactly how it feels. Or option 2. Write down 3 things you're grateful for and expand one into a paragraph of description. While writing the paragraph, once again, be sure to focus on the somatic address of your gratitude. Either option works. Both will start to shift perception, tilting the positivity ratio in a more optimal direction. And it doesn't take long. The research shows that as little as 3 weeks of daily gratitude is enough to start the rewiring. Finally, there also appears to be a strong link between gratitude and flow. In research conducted by the Flow Research Collective and USC neuroscientist Glenn Fox, we saw a direct link between a daily gratitude practice and a high-flow lifestyle. Why? It appears that the optimism and confidence produced by gratitude lower anxiety, which makes us less fearful of stretching to the edge of our abilities and more able to target the challenge skills sweet spot, flow's most important trigger. Mindfulness. If you're interested in developing the grit to control your thoughts, then you're interested in the gap. There's a little gap, no more than a millisecond, between the moment a thought arises and the moment our brain attaches an emotion to that thought. Once that feeling is attached, especially if it's negative, there's usually too much energy in the system to shut it down. But if you can get into that gap between thought and emotion, you can replace a bad thought with a better one, neutralizing the stress response in the short term and reprogramming the brain in the long. This is one of the great benefits of a mindfulness practice. Mindfulness is as advertised, the act of paying attention to one's mind. This isn't a spiritual practice, it's a cognitive tool. By observing your thoughts as they arise, you'll start to notice this gap between thought and feeling, and soon discover the simple act of noticing gives you freedom. Once there's space to move, there's freedom to choose, and you can become active rather than reactive. Once again, you have 2 options. Option 1. Single-point mindfulness. This is where you put all of your attention on one thing: your breath, a candle flame, a repeated word or phrase, the sound of wind in the distance. Take your pick. But when you pick, at least in the beginning, choose something that resonates with how you typically like to receive information. If you're moved by words, find a word that moves you. If you're more kinesthetically oriented, then focus on sensations. Once you've picked your point of focus, sit quietly and focus on that point. That's the game. Start with 5 minutes a day. Pick a time when you need to be calm. Before you start your day, before a big meeting, to mellow out before coming home to your kids. Long, slow breaths. The research shows that when our inhales and exhales are of equal length, we're balancing sympathetic responses, fight or flight, with parasympathetic responses, rest and relax. This calms us down quickly, and the calm helps us focus even harder. If 5 minutes feels good, extend to 6 or 7, or however long you want to keep going. Studies show that we get stress reduction and lowered anxiety from as little as 5 minutes of mindfulness a day, while the larger cognitive benefits, heightened focus, optimism, resilience, and emotional control, really start to kick in at 12 to 20 minutes a day. Obviously, especially in the beginning of each session, the mind will do what minds do. It will wander. Expect it, notice it, and simply return your focus to that single point. Don't judge yourself for a lack of thought control. Simply notice those thoughts you couldn't control. Then move on. It's called mindfulness because you're learning to mind the mind. Iron-fisted thought control isn't the point. The point is simply noticing that, wow, iron-fisted thought control is a fantasy. Put differently, the best way to develop the grit to control your thoughts is to first start to notice how uncontrollable thought actually is. Second option, an open senses meditation. Here, simply pay attention to everything flooding into your brain. Watch the show. Don't engage. One thing to note for creatives: single-point meditation heightens convergent thinking and dampens divergent thinking. Open senses meditation does the opposite. So if you're an architect working on a project that requires far-flung connections, go open senses. If you're a lawyer trying to bomb-proof a contract, single-point focus is your tool. Both approaches retrain the brain, teaching it a simple lesson. We are most effective at dealing with life's challenges when we're aware, observant, non-reactive, and non-judgmental. Personally, I take a cross-training approach. I blend a couple of single-point mindfulness sessions a week with a couple of open senses yoga practices. My mindfulness preference is 10 to 20 minutes of box breathing, followed by 10 minutes of open senses meditation. My yoga preference is Ashtanga, mainly because it's sort of breakdancing in slow motion, and this holds my attention more than other forms. Also, because Ashtanga emphasizes breath and concentration, the instructors tend to talk less, which is important if you're trying to use the practice to learn how to extend the gap between thought and feeling. That said, don't assume that what works for me works for you. Conduct your own experiment. The grit to master fear. The first time I met big wave surfer Laird Hamilton was in the early 2000s. ESPN magazine had asked me to interview him as part of an article on aging action sport athletes, those over 30 graybeards who were clearly, in that magazine's opinion, nearing the end of their once legendary careers. The problem was that Laird wasn't near the end of anything. At the time we met, he'd just invented toe-in surfing, had constructed his first hydrofoil, and was only beginning to think about paddle surfing, 3 activities that would soon reshape the future of action sports. Yet ESPN was so sure Laird was over the hill that they sent me to talk to him about the experience of being over the hill. Solid journalistic instincts. At the time, Hamilton was the widely acknowledged king of action sports, considered the toughest of the tough, and with a reputation for being especially tough on journalists. I was terrified. Laird did not disappoint. He liked to do activities with journalists. 3 activities were the minimum requirement. Our first was a surf session. Our second, a jet ski lesson. The surf session went okay because the waves were mostly small. Then the surf turned soupy, and Laird decided to teach me how to jump a jet ski off waves. It didn't seem to matter that I had never ridden a jet ski before. As an introduction, Laird put me on the back of his and took off. We went flying across the ocean. I was not, shall we say, emotionally prepared for the speed. When I was 12 years old, a friend's older brother put me on the back of a dirt bike and gunned it, attempting to ride as fast as possible through a forest. He missed a turn, and I got flung from the bike and into a tree. I was bruised, but not broken, except for my nerves. Ever since, especially when I'm not driving, being on the back of any machine took a tremendous act of will. In the case of that jet ski, after about 5 minutes of terror, I couldn't take it anymore. But that wasn't all that unusual. By the time I met Laird, terror was a familiar experience, maybe my most familiar experience. I felt like I was always afraid. It was a near constant in my life, and I hated that fear. I hated myself for feeling afraid. I felt like a coward and a failure. In fact, I hated the feeling of fear so much that I had started to do anything that terrified me. It was easier to do the thing that scared me than to live with the shame of that fear. And that explains my next decision. Laird had promised that if I got bounced from the jet ski, the worst that could happen was I'd get the wind knocked out of me. At around 50 miles per hour, I decided to test his theory. I jumped. I crashed. The wind was, in fact, knocked out of me. Other things as well. Then Laird swung the jet ski around to pick me up, and when he was helping me back aboard, said 2 words that changed my entire relationship to fear. "You too," is what he said. What he meant was that, just like me, he, the widely acknowledged king of action sports, toughest of the tough, also felt fear. And he also hated himself for feeling that fear. And just like me, he had also learned to go right at his fear as a way of relieving his fear. This was news to me. I thought bravery meant not being afraid. I thought that was how men were supposed to feel, or more specifically, not to feel. I had no idea that fear was okay. Back on the beach, Laird explained further. Fear is the most common emotion in my life. I've been afraid for so long, well, honestly, I can't ever remember not being afraid. It's what you do with that fear that makes all the difference. Laird is absolutely correct. If you're interested in impossible, then you're interested in challenge, and if you're interested in challenge, you're going to be scared. The emotion is fundamental. We all feel it. It's what we do with it that makes the difference. Every successful person I've met is running from something just as fast as they're running toward something. Why? Simple. Fear is a fantastic motivator, which is why learning to treat fear as a challenge to rise toward rather than a threat to be avoided can make such a profound difference in our lives. This approach takes our most primal drive, the need for safety and security, and gets it to work for our benefit. As a result, focus comes for free. We naturally pay attention to the stuff that scares us. Hell, when something really scares us, the hard part is not paying attention to it. Fear drives attention. This is huge. Something that normally requires a ton of energy now happens automatically. Along similar lines, all powerful emotions heighten mnemonic retention, and fear perhaps most of all. Studies show that we remember bad experiences far more easily than good experiences, which means using fear as a motivator provides focus for free while also enhancing learning. The big point is this: fear is a constant in peak performance. If you don't learn to work with this emotion, it's certainly going to learn to work with you. But if you can take all of that energy and use it to drive focus and concentration in the short term, and as a directional arrow in the long, more on this in a moment, then you've added an extremely potent force to your stack of grit skills. A fear practice. Kristen Ulmer is one of the best athletes in history, also one of the bravest. A big mountain skier, ski mountaineer, ice climber, rock climber, and paraglider with a long history of the impossible. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Ulmer was voted the best female extreme skier in the world 12 years in a row, which is a level of dominance rarely seen in sport. Then she left that career to pursue another, becoming one of the world's leading experts on fear and coaching over 10,000 individuals along the way. Ulmer believes that the first step to transforming one's relationship to fear involves developing a regular fear practice. Everyone has the same problem, she explains. Not only does the amygdala filter all incoming information, most of those filters are set up in early childhood by experiences we can barely remember. The result? We often don't even recognize that the emotion we're feeling is fear. Instead, it gets misinterpreted and redirected, showing up as blame, anger, sadness, or in irrational thoughts and behavior. To overcome this, you have to develop an awareness of your fear. You have to start by noticing fear in the body, she says, the actual kinesthetic sensation. Any form of emotional or even physical discomfort is where you'll find it. Then spend some time not focusing on it with your mind, but feeling it in your body, which is very different. Embrace it. Treat it like a friend. Ask it what it's trying to tell you. If you do this, you'll find fear is not nearly as unpleasant as we thought. It's our attempt to avoid the fear that's so uncomfortable. But once you actually put your full attention on the sensation of fear, it dissipates. It's counterintuitive, but this kind of direct attention to bodily sensation actually dissolves the sensation. Simultaneously, Ulmer also recommends changing your language around fear. Instead of saying, "Do it despite the fear," say, "Do it because of the fear." Look at fear as excitement or as an emotion designed to help you focus. Treat fear like a playmate, suggests Ulmer. This transforms the emotion from a problem to be solved into a resource to be savored. Once you've started to befriend fear, you need to build upon this foundation. Laird Hamilton believes the best way forward is to practice regular risk-taking. Once you start confronting your fears, he explains, you quickly realize that imagination is greater than reality. But fear is an expensive emotion that requires a lot of energy to produce. Once you realize that imagination is greater than reality, why waste all that energy on something that's not that scary? By confronting your fears, this forces the body to recalibrate, and the next time you confront something similar, it evokes a smaller response. But how to actually confront our fears? Science shows there are only two options. Either build up a tolerance slowly, what psychologists call systematic desensitization, or go all in at once, what's appropriately called flooding. Either way, the process is the same. First, as Ulmer suggested, learn to identify fear in your system, either as a tightness in your body or a tightness in your thought pattern. Then, think about other situations where you've encountered something similar, felt something similar, and have successfully overcome it. How'd you do that? What psychological skills did you use that first time around? Once you're clear on those skills, practice them again and again. For example, say public speaking fills you with dread. First, identify the location and expression of that dread in your system. Is it a queasiness in your gut? Are your thoughts racing? Maybe both? Now think about other times in your life when you felt these same sensations, yet managed to rise to the occasion. A time when your head spun and gut churned before you had a difficult conversation with a friend. Yet the act of having that difficult conversation, of pushing past those bad feelings, actually strengthened your relationship. Finally, what skills helped you the first time around? Did you take 10 deep breaths before talking to your friend? Cool. Now practice deep breathing techniques. Did self-awareness and emotional intelligence play a role? Great. Now practice those skills as well. Also, as psychologist Michael Gervais reminds us, know how to judge progress. You want to measure how well you use those skills, and did they create more psychological space? Learning to create space is how you learn to play in hostile, rugged, and stressful environments. Even better, since risk is a flow trigger, flow follows focus, and consequences catch our attention. This kind of regular fear practice will automatically increase time spent in the zone. When we take a risk, dopamine is released into our system, which is the brain's way of rewarding exploratory behavior. And any kind of risk will produce dopamine. So take physical risks for sure, but also try emotional risks, intellectual risks, or creative risks. Social risks work especially well. The brain processes social risk and physical risk with the exact same structures, which explains why fear of public speaking is the #1 fear in the world, and not something that seems to make more evolutionary sense, like the fear of getting eaten by a grizzly bear. Yet everyone is different. Laird Hamilton might need to surf 50-foot waves to pull this trigger. For me, a 5-footer is more than enough. And that's me. For anyone on the even shyer, meeker side, you can pull this trigger and practice taking risks merely by trying a new activity, or speaking up at a meeting, or asking a stranger for the time. Then, a few days later, ask 2 strangers, and so forth. The goal is to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. The unpleasant sensation remains, but our relationship to that sensation has been permanently recalibrated, and that's what we're really after. Fear as a compass. If you can learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, you can begin to take the final step in this process, which is learning how to use fear as a compass. For peak performers, fear becomes a directional arrow. Unless the thing in front of them is a dire and immediate threat to be avoided, the best of the best will often head in the direction that scares them most. Why? Once again, focus and flow. Going in the direction that scares you most amplifies attention, and this translates into flow. The boost in performance the state provides then helps us push through our fears and rise to these bigger challenges. But the even larger lift comes afterward, with the discovery that our real potential lies on the other side of our greatest fears. By confronting fear, we are expanding capacity, teaching ourselves to remain psychologically stable and in control, even in situations that feel unstable and uncontrollable. The grit to be your best when you're at your worst. Josh Waitzkin is a peak performance polymath. He started out as the real-life version of the child chess prodigy portrayed in the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, winning the U.S. Junior Chess Nationals in both 1993 and 1994, and earning the title of International Chess Master before the age of 16. Next, he ventured into martial arts, becoming a world champion in Tai Chi push hands, and then, turning his attention to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, earning a black belt under legendary fighter Marcelo Garcia. Afterward, he became a writer, publishing The Art of Learning, which has since become a high-performance classic. Lately, he's taken all that expertise into coaching, where he works with top athletes, investors, and the like. But the point of this long introduction is that Josh Waitzkin has a slightly different take on grit. While Waitzkin believes that perseverance, thought control, and fear mastery are critical for long-term performance, he believes there's an even more important differentiator. The grit that matters most, he says, is learning to be your best when you're at your worst. This is really the difference between elite-level performers and everyone else. And you have to train this kind of grit on its own, as a separate skill. But if you can do this, what you discover is real power, there's real power there, and it's power you probably didn't know you had. Psychologist William James agreed. Over 100 years ago, in an address to the American Philosophical Association titled The Energies of Man, James pointed out that the existence of reservoirs of energy that habitually are not tapped is most familiar to us as the phenomenon of second wind. Ordinarily, we stop when we meet the first effective layer, so to call it, of fatigue. We have then walked, played, or worked enough, and desist. That amount of fatigue is an efficacious obstruction, on this side of which our usual life is cast. But if an unusual necessity forces us to press onward, a surprising thing occurs. The fatigue gets worse up to a certain critical point, when gradually or suddenly it passes away, and we are fresher than before. We have evidently tapped a new level of energy. There may be layer after layer of this experience. A third and a fourth wind may supervene. Mental activity shows the phenomenon as well as physical, and in exceptional cases we may find, beyond the very extremity of fatigue distress, amounts of ease and power that we never dreamed ourselves to own. Sources of strength habitually not taxed at all, because habitually we never push through the obstruction, never pass those early critical points. The good news? There are easy ways to train this kind of grit. The bad news? It doesn't feel very good along the way. In fact, the only way to train being your best when at your worst is to, well, you guessed it, train when you're at your worst. In action sports, for example, one of the secrets to staying out of the hospital is learning to maintain balance under conditions of exhaustion. To train for this, at the tail end of every workout, I close with a high-intensity jump rope session to ensure exhaustion, and then get on an indo board, a very dynamic balance board, for 10 minutes. If the board touches the ground during that period, I start over. It's a way of training balance under conditions of serious distress, a best at worst exercise that has definitely reduced my medical bills. I take a similar approach to training cognitive skills. When practicing a new speech, I always do one run-through from hell. I pick a time when I haven't gotten enough sleep, have already worked for 10 hours, and put in a heavy training session at the gym. After all that, I take my dogs into the backcountry, hike up a mountain, and give my speech along the way. If I can sound coherent scrambling up cliffs, I can sound coherent under any conditions. Or almost any conditions. When it comes to creativity, learning to be your best when conditions are at their worst requires an additional step. The reason is physiological. Bad conditions mean more stress, yet the more stress hormones, the less divergent thinking. Tufts Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry, Keith Ablow, solves this with a bit of cognitive reframing. I maintain a very strong philosophical position that being burnt out is a good thing. When I'm exhausted because of work done for a worthy goal, my exhaustion is an offering. By seeing it this way, I'm reframing exhaustion from a negative to a positive, and this confers a certain immunity to exhaustion. It also dampens down fear, which can often be the byproduct of exhaustion, but is a huge barrier to creativity. Just lowering anxiety a bit seems to free up hidden levels of innovative thinking. The grit to train your weaknesses. In the last section, we saw that training to be at your best when you're at your worst requires practicing under conditions of extreme duress. The kind of grit that results from this practice ensures that when those conditions show up in the real world, you've got the prior experience to control fear, maintain focus, and utilize your skills to the utmost. But this is only the first half of the equation. The second half involves training your weaknesses. Even if you practice being your best when you're at your worst, there will always be a few weak links in that chain, and these potential fail points become actual fail points once the pressure gets turned up. There's nothing surprising here. Our weaknesses tend to be the stuff we like the least and are least motivated to train. Unfortunately, in a crisis situation, as the Greek poet Archilochus pointed out so long ago, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. Once again, the issue is fear. The more fear in the equation, the fewer options at our disposal. In times of strife, the brain limits our choices to speed up our reaction times, the extreme example being fight or flight, where the situation is so dire that the brain gives us only 3 potential actions. Freezing is the third. Yet the same thing happens to a lesser degree under any high-stress conditions. And the responses we fall back upon under duress are the ones we fully automatized, those habitual patterns we've executed over and over again. Thus, the solution: identify your biggest weaknesses and get to work. This is why skier Shane McConkey would consistently seek out the worst conditions on the mountain, why Arnold Schwarzenegger always began his weightlifting sessions targeting his weakest muscle group, and why Nobel laureate Richard Feynman decided, late in his life, to learn how to speak to women. Of course, Feynman decides to train this particular weakness by hanging out at strip clubs, but that's a different story. The bigger issue is that training our weaknesses can be trickier than it sounds. Cognitive biases impact perception, so getting a clear bead on ourselves can be difficult. One way around this problem? Ask for help. Ask friends to identify your weaknesses. You want them to be truthful, but not go overboard. A list of your top 3 weaknesses is often enough to provide fodder for training, without the ego blow that comes from hearing everything that's wrong with you. More important, your friends also come with built-in biases, so don't just ask 1. Ask 3 or 4 or 5, and look for correlations among their answers. If a weakness shows up on 5 different lists, that's a pretty good place to start. Chances are the items on your list fall into 3 categories: physical, emotional, and cognitive. Lack of stamina is a physical weakness. A hair-trigger temper is an emotional issue. The inability to think at scale is a cognitive problem. But all 3 can't be approached in the same way. The best way to train up physical and emotional weaknesses is head-on, but slowly. Don't expect you'll solve these problems in a week or 2. Old habits die hard. Learn to love slow progress. Learn to forgive yourself for the inevitable backsliding. And, of course, expect to be uncomfortable along the way. Tackling our cognitive weaknesses is perhaps the more difficult challenge. But Josh Waitzkin has developed a method that gets consistently good results. He suggests reviewing the past 3 months of your life and asking, what did I believe 3 months ago that I know is not true today? Then follow that up with 2 key questions. Why did I believe that? What kind of thinking error did I commit to arrive at that erroneous conclusion? The good news is that these sorts of thinking errors tend to be categorical. We have blind spots that lend our mistakes a certain consistency. So weaknesses tend to have root causes. By training the root causes, you can erase whole categories of weakness at once. The grit to recover. There's a dark side to all this grit: exhaustion and overwhelm. Burnout isn't just extreme stress, it's peak performance gone off the rails. Burnout is identified by 3 symptoms: exhaustion, depression, and cynicism. It is the byproduct of repeated and prolonged stress, not the result of working long hours, rather the result of working long hours under specific conditions: high risk, a lack of sense of control, a misalignment of passion and purpose, and long and uncertain gaps between effort and reward. Unfortunately, these are all conditions that arise during our pursuit of high, hard goals. This is why it's time to get gritty about recovery. And grit tends to be required. It's hard for peak performers to relax. If momentum matters most, sitting still feels like laziness. And the more aligned with passion and purpose we become, the more wasteful time off starts to feel. Yet, since burnout leads to significant decline in cognitive function, making it one of the most common enemies of sustained peak performance, you absolutely have to get gritty about recovery. And not all recovery strategies are the same. The main choices are passive and active. Passive recovery is TV and a beer. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, alcohol disrupts sleep, and TV keeps the brain active in an unusual way. Real recovery requires shifting brain waves into the alpha range. And while TV shuts down your higher cortical centers, which is good for recovery, those constantly shifting images overstimulate the visual system, pulling the brain right out of alpha and into beta, which is the brainwave signature of awake and alert. Active recovery is the opposite. It ensures that the brain stays off and the body can mend. By flushing stress hormones from the system and shifting brainwaves into alpha first, then delta later, active recovery practices allow us to reset. Sure, peak performers take this to considerable extremes: hyperbaric chambers, sensory deprivation tanks, nutritional specialists micro-counting caloric intake. These are useful tools, and go this route if interested. But the research shows you can get gritty about recovery in 3 simpler steps. First, protect your sleep. Deep delta wave sleep is critical for recovery and for learning. It's when memory consolidation takes place. You need a dark room, cold temperatures, and no screens. Our cell phone's glow is in the same frequency range as daylight, and this messes with the brain's ability to shut down completely. And shut the cell phone down for a while. Most people need 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, but figure out what's optimal for you. Then make sure you consistently get what you need. Second, put an active recovery protocol into place. Bodywork, restorative yoga, tai chi, long walks in the woods, what people have begun calling, much to my chagrin, nature bathing. Epsom salt baths, saunas, and hot tub soaks are the traditional methods. My personal preference is an infrared sauna. I try to do 3 sessions a week, 45 minutes each. In the sauna, I split my time between reading a book and practicing mindfulness. Saunas lower cortisol. When coupled to the stress reduction produced by mindfulness, this 1-2 punch hyper-accelerates recovery. Third, total resets matter. Everybody has a point of no return. If your work is consistently subpar and frustration levels are growing, it's time to step away for a few days. For me, this is once every 10 to 12 weeks. My go-to break is a solitary 2-day ski trip. I'll read books, slide down snow, and try to talk to no one. But that's me. Figure out what's you. Most important, stay in front of this problem. Burnout costs you both motivation and momentum. In the short run, because chronic stress interferes with cognitive function, it'll have you producing poor quality work that needs to be redone. In the long run, because burnout has permanent neurological effects on everything from problem-solving to memory to emotional regulation, it can completely derail a quest for the impossible. So, while inserting mandatory timeouts into your schedule can feel like a waste of time, it's nothing compared to the time you'll waste once burnout sets in. If you get gritty about recovery sooner rather than later, you'll go farther, faster as a result. 6. The habit of ferocity. Peter Diamandis is busy. My good friend and frequent writing partner, Abundance, Bold, and The Future is Faster Than You Think, is the founder of the X Prize Foundation, the co-founder of Singularity University, and the entrepreneurial force behind 22 different companies, In 2014, Fortune put him on their list of the world's 50 greatest leaders, and he remains the only person I know who has ever appeared on a stamp. Yet, at the time we got to know each other, all of this was still to come. Peter and I met in 1999, in the early days of our careers. We met because I wrote one of the first major articles on the X Prize, which was both Peter's mad attempt to open the space frontier and a $10 million purse for the first person to build and fly a spaceship into low Earth orbit twice in 2 weeks. A reusable spaceship was the very thing NASA couldn't build, but it remained a tantalizing possibility. If we didn't burn up our rockets every time we left the planet, then the cost of getting off-world would plummet. It was, Peter felt, the necessary first step to opening the space frontier. I spent 6 months reporting the story, interviewing dozens of experts along the way. Everybody agreed Peter was out of his mind. A reusable spaceship was never going to happen. NASA said it would cost billions of dollars and require tens of thousands of engineers. All of the major aerospace manufacturers reiterated NASA's point, only in far more colorful language. Winning the X Prize, according to all of the world's leading experts, was absolutely impossible. Not for long. Less than a decade later, maverick aerospace designer Burt Rutan launched Spaceship One into low Earth orbit. 2 weeks later, he did it again. Did he have 10,000 engineers aiding his cause? Nope. He had around 30. Did it cost billions of dollars? Nah. $25 million was the actual price tag. The impossible had become possible, and because Peter and I had become good friends along the way, I got to watch the feat up close and in person. So what does impossible really look like? It looks familiar. Here's how Peter helped unlock the space frontier. He woke up, typed at his computer for a while, then had breakfast. Then he went someplace and had a conversation. Then he went someplace else and had another conversation. Then he opened up his computer and punched the keys again. Eventually, he had lunch. After lunch, he went somewhere else and had another conversation. Then he talked on the phone a while. Then he punched more keys on the computer. There were airplane rides and trips to the gym. Every now and again, he grabbed a shower, got some sleep, or went to the bathroom. And repeat, and repeat. This is what pulling off the impossible looks like up close. But not just for Peter, for just about everyone. Excellence always has a cost. On a daily basis, if your goal is greatness, then you're going to put just about every available hour toward that goal. From this perspective, it takes the same amount of time and energy to be the very best dry cleaner in Cleveland, Ohio, as it does to unlock the space frontier. Of course it does. Excellence, no matter what level, will always take everything we've got. So what really sets impossible stalkers apart? As far as I can tell, 3 core characteristics. The first is the size of the original vision. It's hard to achieve the amazing by accident. You have to dream big. Peter wanted to go into space. He wanted other people to come along for the ride. His dream was unreasonable and irrational, but as Peter loves to say, the day before something's truly a breakthrough, it's a crazy idea. And here we've already taken care of business. If you've turned curiosity into passion, and passion into purpose, and use that information to sculpt a massively transformative purpose, you're already dangerous. If you're building on that foundation by walking the path to mastery, just keep walking, as that's the path toward impossible. The second characteristic is the amount of flow in the equation. Impossible will always be a lengthy journey. Flow is one of the key ingredients in long-term perseverance. The amount of flow an activity produces directly equates to our willingness to pursue it for years on end. But here, too, you're covered. All the steps in this primer have been built around flow's triggers, so just following along should increase the time you spend in state. and more on this later. The third characteristic shared by impossible slayers is what I've come to call the habit of ferocity. This is the ability to immediately and automatically rise to any challenge. Whenever peak performers encounter life's difficulties, they instinctively lean in. In fact, they lean in before they can even think about not leaning in. In the face of life's obstacles, the best of the best don't have to worry about staying the course. So well arranged is their motivational stack, and so well trained are their grit reflexes, that rising to a challenge happens without their even noticing. This matters for a couple of reasons. First, there's our familiar problem. We don't rise to the level of our expectations, we sink to the level of our training. Anxiety, inside an fMRI, looks a little like OCD. A small network, a tight thought loop, the brain running circles around itself with no way to stop and no new solutions. On any path to peak performance, if you don't develop the habit of ferocity, that is, automatize the motivation triad of drive, goals, and grit, sooner or later you'll trip over your own fear. It's basic biology. Second, the obvious. Impossible is not easy. But the habit of ferocity allows you to take all the energy that comes from suffering and turn it into fuel. My best friend, Michael Wharton, ran track in high school. He had a great coach with unusual methods. When they went out for long runs, whenever they encountered a hill, the team had to shift their focus entirely to core running skills. Long strides, strong arms, high kicks. Note, the focus wasn't on speed or acceleration, it was on the perfect technique that, over time, results in speed and acceleration. At first, of course, this sucked. It made for incredibly grueling workouts. But pretty soon, they got used to it. Then it became a challenge they could lean into. Then their skill increased, their speed increased, and suddenly, uphill sprints were part of the program. After a little while, the team didn't even notice. A hill would present itself, and before any of them had even realized what they were doing, they were halfway up the hill and climbing fast. This was a distinct advantage. When most runners encounter hills, everyone except the uber elite slows down. It's an automatic response, the brain trying to conserve energy. The uber elite, meanwhile, try to keep their pace the same. But Michael's team learned to accelerate in the face of the challenge. This is a ferocious habit. The habit of ferocity is the same philosophy applied to every aspect of your life. Of course, this application can take a while. Peter likes to say, figure out what you would die for, then live for it. But really live for it, weeks, months, years. In psychological terms, what you're trying to develop is an action orientation, though taken to the extreme. The good news? An action orientation produces more flow, primarily because it primes you to always be pushing on that challenge skills balance. The bad news? Nothing here happens quickly. The habit you're hunting is hard work, yet without it, the impossible remains just that, the impossible. In different terms, William James opens the very first psychology textbook ever written with a discussion of habit. Why habit? Because James was convinced that human beings are habit machines, and the easiest way to live an extraordinary life is to develop extraordinary habits. As the saying goes, sow an action and you reap a habit. Sow a habit and you reap a character. Sow a character and you reap a destiny. Pretty much everything we've learned since has confirmed James's suspicions, meaning his advice is fantastic overall, and doubly critical when applied to the habit of ferocity. It comes down to saved time. If your interest is extreme accomplishment, the habit of ferocity helps us maximize our 24 hours. To go back to my friend's track team, Most of us are just regular runners, meaning we slow down when the challenge level rises. But once the habit of ferocity takes hold, you're in before you know you're in. Sure, maybe this only saves 10 minutes per challenge, but that adds up over time. If you're solving a few hard problems a day, this 20-minute total becomes more than 100 hours a year, which adds up to a 5-day advantage over the competition. What's more, developing the habit of ferocity also lowers cognitive load. We burn a lot of calories being anxious about the task ahead. But once we can automatize our lean-in instinct, we not only save time, we save energy. So you'll not only gain 5 days over the competition, you'll have more fuel in the tank with which to attack those days. Call it compound interest. So how to develop the habit of ferocity? Follow the exercises in this book. Align all of your intrinsic motivators. Augment this stack with proper goal setting. Train all 6 levels of grit. And just keep on keeping on. So how do you measure progress? How to know you've truly developed the habit of ferocity? Easy. When someone